let's talk about what we're going to talk about real fast. Let's just get into some things. So we're going to talk about things from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. But first, we need to set a stage and get a little understanding of these SNPs and everything. So we're going to get a little quick run through of the SNPs, and then we're going to talk about some things in the Iron Age and Bronze Age. Okay. So first things first, we're going to be talking about what is basically of the SNPs of E. We're going to be talking about some movements that it makes in time. And why is it important? Because this E lineage, this DE lineage, is actually a very important lineage that not a lot of people look at, but when you look at the roots, it tells us a story. It tells us a very important story and a very important thing that we need to know. Let me just read something real fast from this little thing right here. It says a group of people with YAP insertion. That's what's important. The DE group always has YAP. They always have a YAP insertion. It says they migrated from South Asia, right? Why? Because D actually roots in Asia by the German people, right? To Central Asia. This is important. It's let us know some movements and reach the Mediterranean. Now, what's interesting is it's letting us know that the DE group went all the way to Asia and reaches all the way to the Mediterranean. We can look at the fossils. We're going to get some ideas of these things. We're talking about the root. They gave rise to E lineage, right? They talk about that a long time ago with mutations at M40 and M96. So that's letting us know about the D split and the E split. So that M96 is actually E-M96, the first E. The E lineage dispersed to Africa, Middle East, Southern and Eastern Europe, right? Lineage E1 is predominant over entire Africa. And we're going to find out when did that happen, right? We're going to get to the real details of that, right?
Right.
So in Middle East and Europe, this back migration of people to Africa through the Levant is supported by a study that they had previously studied and some other studies that they previously studied and some studies in 2017 and some in 2004 and 2018. YAP E plus migrated back to Africa with other Eurasian haplogroups, such as lineage R1b. We're going to be looking at R1b today and long lineage a long time ago, a T. We're going to be looking at T today as well. We're going to be looking at R and T. These are actually highly related. But did you know that we had a request a long time ago about the said people who migrated to Africa that may had spoke a Semitic language, but what's interesting is Semitic is a language as it is a bloodline. So there's a difference between language and bloodline. So someone can pick up language, but they can't pick up bloodline.
There's a very important, point you just pointed out. You can pick up the Semitic tongue, but just because you speak the Semitic language, that does not mean you descend biologically from Semitic peoples. Just like us over here in America, or wherever we live now, we speak a tongue that is not of ours. You get what I'm saying? That is not of the progenitor that we go back to individually.
Correct. And if this live ever sounds laggy or anything like that, jump to Will's channel. He'll be streaming it at the same time so we can get a nice understanding of what's going on here.
Yes, I'm still getting that up right now, but it should be up and live in the next 5 minutes. So just give me a second.
No problem. All right, so continuing on. So the reason why is because we got another note we're going to go over, and we're going to talk about something. I'm going to read the title, and we're going to address it. R1b in Africa before E1b1b, and T in Africa before E1b1a fossils. We'll talk about it by fossils. We're going to show you that E is Eurasian. That actually would be close to the areas, and we'll get to it as we go. So no surprises yet. Let's keep on going. Which has been observed in high frequencies in northern Cameroon and low frequencies in Africa. So remember, it's very interesting. We find T and R's in Africa. So just a very interesting paper. I'll point out where we are getting that from right here, 2021, right? This is going to be genomic diversity of people in India, right? Focus on mtDNA, Y chromosome, polymorphism, and getting into those things in the survey of India. So very, very important. So as we go over these things, I first need to address two channels that I want to advertise real fast. When I say advertise the show, if you want to join for free, but I think these are some very deep channels on Discord. It may be a Discord. We don't have Discords. We solve problems. But let me show you a channel real fast. A creationist channel. This one is called Central Creation. I highly recommend it. It's a very, very, very deep channel that goes into creation. Now, the reason why I went here is because I want to show you something real fast from this channel. Let me show you something real fast that we talked about just recently that I think is kind of important. Might have to scroll a little bit because we have some deep conversations, but not too much because we just talked about it yesterday. All right. So let me show you something real fast that we talked about real fast. All right. So what's interesting is this. Now, as I go over this, I'm going to show you some years that are going to be what looks like astronomical years, right? And if you think I'm talking small numbers, if you had heard me speak about the Iberusians, don't think I focus on them because that was the E group. That doesn't mean that that's the oldest in Africa, nor a older modern human in Africa. We'll talk about those things on this other note. But let's talk about some things about these layers. Why you got to be careful with these layers real fast. So I'm just going to give a quick 5-minute summary of these layers. This was really important to know about. If you never heard of these type of things in the ground, right? Let me just show you what it is, what it's called. Sometimes I keep saying this word weird. Escarpment. If you ever heard of an escarpment, it's evidence of pretty much the flood. I'm gonna tell you why it's evidence of the flood real fast. Just a real quick summary so that we can get understanding of these years as I show you these years, right? So it's very, very important to understand. I'm not gonna play any of this now. I'm gonna talk about it another time. I'm just gonna do a quick summary of it all because it goes deep into how we got these different layers of pretty much Earth caked up on Earth, and that's actually how we actually count layers. We count layers because we got these type of Earth layers. But what's interesting is we start to see different artifacts in different areas, right? So it's very important about these certain layers. So we're talking things that when we're talking these years, we're talking things that go all the way hundreds of thousands, millions of years, stuff like that. But the reason why is because this thing called escarpments, right? Very important. That actually evidence of how water basically laid settlement all over these pieces of land. And you're going to have basically what is called basically what you will see today as layers, or what you will know as flood layers. For example, you can see right here, this will be Arabia. Why am I showing you Arabia? Watch what I'll show you here. Now, you're probably wondering why some people only settled on this part of Arabia and not this part of Arabia. Now, if you see here, you see different layers. What you'll see is different layers. That's a Jurassic layer right there. They say your different types of layers. You got your Triassic layer. So they say all those things were laid over said millions, billions of years right there. But it took a long time, right, to grow on those things, right? So what's interesting about this fascinating thing is that it actually let us know how these layers actually form. In fact, long ago, these layers were layered by water. In fact, what you're seeing here, if you can see it, this is Arabia. If you see right here, right in this area, you can see this is actually the Arabian plate, and that's the African plate. So if you already know, I always talk about this. Where's Israel? Right at the top of the African plate. And wait a second, this looks like it's underwater, right? Why is it underwater, right? And think about this, and when you think about the land and everything, when you think about how this land is and everything real fast, right? But that's we're just getting there real fast because we're going to get to what we need to talk about. So what's important is actually evident. If you've seen that when people talk about how the land split, what happened was as it pushed, this part of the land, as you can see here, was underneath the water. That's actually important. So this little area over here was actually underneath water. So as these areas was splitting, pushing apart, pushed underneath the water, pushing a lot of those layers on the land. That's important. Why? Because you got to be careful what you find in those layers. You might find some things that might seem like they're a long time ago. Why is that important? Because about those times, they'll say in certain layers about it changed. They'll say it was about the time of after the older dryas, younger dryas. There was a bottleneck. They'll say a bottleneck. Let's talk about it real fast so we can get an understanding of the bottleneck. Why we talk about the bottleneck, right? Very important. Let's talk about something real fast. I'm gonna skip this part because it's just talking about some things that I had talked about that caused the bottleneck, as it says, right? Just goes over some things that happened between such and such time. If you know about the Neanderthal extinction, it wasn't because humans extinct them or killed them, rather. But it says, hence, during the bottleneck, after the population began to recover. So right now, as the population we're going to talk about, because we're going to be talking about a population that's going to rise, said, quote unquote, right? If you know about certain lines, I'll just do a quick scan of what we're going to talk about. As you can see, even just these years are 45, 20. We're going to be talking about yDNA, mtDNA, as you see, but let's not dive in yet on that. So the reason why I'm showing you that is because of this. As it says, starting around, like they say, the dates will change. They say this one says 12,000 during the Younger Dryas. They say there was a mass extinction event, right? It said wiped out most large mammals and everything, and many different types of peoples and everything. And we know that during that time, not just during that time, but we also know during that time, we're going to get our Y chromosome bottleneck, right? And what do I mean by the Y chromosome bottleneck, right? Evidence of pretty much a diversity of a large population that went through a type of catastrophic event that a small population grew to what we are today, the population that we see today. In fact, at that same time, cheetahs also go through a bottleneck. In fact, 75% of Earth's mammals go through a bottleneck, right? So a lot of different animals go through
cut you off, brother, but you're making a great point. I just want to throw this out there. What can you explain real quick what caused this bottleneck?
Yeah, yep. And that's exactly what we're about to talk about right now. This is what it's called. More likely, there was a dynastic dip. And then they say 5,000 to 10,000, they say rather Homo sapiens, or 5,000, 10,000 people, they say struggle together in pitiful little clumps, hunting and gathering for thousands of years, they'll say, right? But this is an important thing about it. They'll say that this happened during the Stone Age, right? Times where they don't have metals and stuff like that. A lot of the stuff was what was destroyed and stuff. But they say that's how humans recovered after the catastrophic. But let's get a little more deeper into that, because this is actually what some of the studies are actually saying. Let me show you something real fast. Something weird happened to men 7,000 years ago. We finally know why. Right. So what's interesting is it talks about the same. Remember how I was showing you about those layers? It talks about the same events. So remember how we was talking a little earlier up here. The reason why this is important, because this says 70. If you remember, the out of Africa idea was saying it's about 75,000 years ago humans left and all that. But what's interesting is that's scaling on fossils, right? And if we start looking at some of the papers like this one that's loading up right here, we can actually see something interesting in what it's saying here, right? Something weird happened to men 7,000 years ago, and we finally know why, right? So they just go on and talk about some things that happen, right? I'm going to read the quote real fast on what it says on there, just to get a little more into it, to get a little understanding on it. Groups of males in Europe post-Neolithic, right? And it says pastoralist cultures appear to descend, right? There's actually to understand they basically descend in basically small numbers and whatnot, to get a little understanding on it. But it also lets you know that when you compare it to hunter and gatherers, right? So it's talking about a transition that happens, right? Because remember, when Noah comes there, he's a pastoralist and he's a farmer, right? He's a farmer because he also is going to be planting those different plants in the ground, and he's going to be harvesting those grapes to make his wine, right? And that's when,
I don't want to keep cutting you off, but that's another good point, because not only was, well, you like you said Abraham was an agro
yep,
specific,
and Noah,
right? They
we're
were
talking about early
agriculturalists, right? One thing we see amongst their descendants in Africa, the Bedouins, the Berber, or the North African and Sub-Saharan African populations, one is pastoralist and one is agriculturalist. So that's
right.
Another connection right there to throw out there.
That's right. In fact, here's the clarity to it, because we're talking about those change of those hunter gatherers becoming farmers, but look what it says here. But the Neolithic Y chromosome bottleneck, as it is known, has been something of a puzzle since the discovery in 2015. This is because it was only observed. Now remember, if there was a bottleneck with Noah, and we all came from Noah, there would be a bottleneck on what's called the Y chromosome, because all males would come to Noah. And that's also what they observed in the genes on the Y chromosome that get passed down from father to son, which means it only affected men. Most surprisingly to us, we detect another male specific bottleneck during the period of global growth. The signal of this bottleneck dates to the time of the period 4,000 to 8,000 years ago. Notice how the years are getting right about the time of the flood, and then a bottleneck happens. It says when humans in different parts of the world have become sedentary farmers. Remember pastoralism, how Noah was a pastoralist? As we know, Noah was a farmer, right? In Genesis 9 and 20, and Noah began to be a farmer, and he planted a vineyard, right? Right. It's very important. And we can go into one more piece real fast, just to let you know that indeed, just the reason why you got to know this, because we're going to go into these layers, and I need you to know that we know the biblical narrative is true. But watch this little study that he was talking about here real fast, right? Talk about Noah as a husbandman, right? He planted a vineyard, right? We already know that. But if we look at the archaeology and we look at all these things, when language spread, right? During the time when we get language spreading, right? After Noah has his sons and language spread, we know that a lot of different cultures tell a flood story, right? In all their different languages, spreading from one source, from one origin, one place, right? Remember how it talks about different places on the mountain? Now, we don't know exactly 100% where they land, but we know the most available areas, because we got the fossils that tell us it was in different areas around areas of where you see Armenia, or in the sense of the mountains of Armenia, right? Mount Judy, right? Even that's places where they talk about, they go to this place called Arata. How you say that? There's different places that it go to, but this is just the summary of what it's talking about. According to the article, right, it just talks about this thing when it talks about grape domestication began about 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, right? When it talks about harvesting wild grapes and everything, let's talk about with Noah and everything. But now that's just something to understand. Obviously, we can get into those deep things and talk about the carbon. We go into these deep things, but I'll talk about that later in a week. So I just the reason why I wanted to do that, because I wanted to quickly express real fast some things that we talk about on this little channel right here, that we go into these deep things about these flood layers and about these layers and about why these things are important when looking at, because there's not just in not just in the areas of where we get obviously the biblical narrative but we get that around the whole world, America, Africa, right? Different areas around the world where we get different layers that's stacked up. We'll talk about that as we go, but I want to do that real fast so that we can get an understanding real fast on what I'm going to talk about now. All right, so let's talk about real fast who goes into Africa. Now, remember how I talked about these layers. So you got to be careful on these years, but we got to work with these years to understand the time. Now, there's certain layers that we should know, certain cultures that's usually in these layers, like this one right here. We know that IJK is in this culture. We know that's a real fossil. So IJK is this. We know that we're going to have splits from sons of, obviously, the E1b1b and E1b1a. So today, I want to, as we have Will, to present the fossils and the evidence of the movements of the actual oldest said African lines. So, and also the evidence of who is that Semitic line that migrated into Africa. So we're going to look at that today. But this is an important thing. I'm going to quickly tell you this important fact. This is a fact. R1b was replaced in Africa by E1b1b, right? Only after 14 said on the scientific scale 14,000, right? And that's small on the scientific scale. By the scientific scale, that scales hundreds of thousands of years, pretty much, right? Or more, right? That's important. Yeah, we know E is actually as young as R and T. So why am I saying that? Why is that important? Because they know that when we look at genetics, there are older lines than the line that is we determine as Noah, which is the BT and CT split that makes your A and B groups, which is Helm, and your DNE groups, which is Shem, and your CF groups, which is Japheth. And those lines is what's the lines that came out of the bottleneck, right? Every line today either comes from A and B, DNE, or CF. That's the lines from the bottleneck. Previously, before that bottleneck, there was other lines, but those are the only lines today. That's the lines from Noah, the sons of Noah. So just to get a little understanding of some movements, right? Now we gotta go about it in the scientific scale. So first things first, we gotta start at what they know as the beginning of movements of early fossils. If you already know, we talked about this before. There's an early fossil called UST Isham. is a fossil that pretty much makes MNOPQR, right? And it also is a high relative of T&L, right? And actually it actually comes from the same thing that T&L comes from, which is K-M9, which actually would connect T and R. So this is actually important because we're going to look at T and R, but we got to note though that roots, right, in this time frame, right? If you never seen it, or you don't already know, right? IJK, right, is easy to find. You can find it on the encyclopedia, but remember, this is a second source, not a first source, right? Or rather, even a third source. So the source will be right here. You can see right here what it's talking about, saying during the Mesolithic time and the said Paleolithic time in this place, which we were just pointing out on this little design right here, right? You see that culture right there. So it's letting us know that in that time, right, they found an IJK. And we know this because we went over this exact paper, right? This exact paper actually went over the fact of after the said quote unquote Younger Dryas, the flood event, and those layers being caked on, right? There's an ice age that happens, right? There's an ice age that happens. And it's important to know. Actually, didn't read that part, but that's something to note too. We go over that as well about the ice age, that the ice age, obviously, the wiping out and all those events, the rising of the water by 400 feet, which is 120 meters, because that's what happened at that time of that bottleneck. The water rise 120 meters or 400 feet. That's a scientific fact that water rise. And we also know at that same time of the bottleneck, the climate got cold, right? And that's what we was talking about right here, where it says the population plummet thanks to the cold, dry climate conditions that left much of the land uninhabitable, right? So that's why a lot of wiping out of different areas and everything we was talking about when we talk about the obviously the all these effects and everything from those things, right? And I'm also gonna show this brother's channel at the end. I got something saved for that. I'm gonna point out something on his channel. But the reason why I want you to know is because after the quote unquote ice age, right, you're gonna get a split of lineages, right? And they're gonna live in certain parts of the world, and they're gonna get with certain females, and others are gonna get with those females, and that's why it's important. We're gonna note this movement. All right. So first, this is just this picture right here. I'm just using this picture because a lot of the information is gonna match with this picture. But this is someone who's I think an independent researcher who's researching all the different sources and everything, and he basically brought up some interesting information that I think is kind of interesting and kind of important. The reason why is because the movements are exactly what I'm going to show you. That there's a line that started over here, and early on it shot over here, but it could not cross into this area because there were a bunch of different Neanderthals and other groups there, not just Neanderthals. But there was as IJK split, the KM9 went this way, and the IJ group settled around this area. So I was mainly over here, and then J was mainly over here and over here. But it stopped this R group from going there, and it went downwards for a while. It'll come out later, and then it'll become a culture called the Coraxis culture. And it'll become the corded ware culture and things like that, the bell beakers. But right now, we're going to note this ancient Isham line is going to go down, and it's going to meet. What's interesting is it's going to move, and it's going to meet with a certain mtDNA that actually would descend from it, and it's U6. So you're actually going to find out the origin of where U6 is moving from and with whom it's moving with. That's going to be important for noting the origin here.
So you saying that U6 was originally up there with J, right there, correct?
Mm-hmm. So right here in this area, it seems that R went by as the J was with some of the U lineages, but it looks like they were having a battle over this U6 lineage and went downwards past the area that actually would, in that time, we would have 39,000 Natufians. That was only like a one or a few that was found. And then this R sweeps by them. It pushes by them, but there's also later on an R that settles in this like upper area over here where the Natufian is going to fill the Arabian area.
That could now this could explain what we see in Morocco.
Yep,
especially.
and that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. Morocco. We're actually going to focus on the origins of the rise of the cultures in Morocco, all the way to who the Iberasian replaced. This is actually going to be who the Iberasians replace.
Yeah, especially with them having that same Natufian, E3 component with that
Mhm,
U6 migrating from the near
mhm,
Levant through the African Rift into the Maghreb. That's real
mhm.
interesting. That picture was real interesting.
And you know what's the most interesting part about this is that what I'm going to show you is also going to basically express how we have a line in Africa before E1b1b gets in Africa, and it also is with these certain groups. I just want to show you this interesting picture that kind of sets a clear divide. So you see this little picture right here.
Right.
So basically, what happens is as the Neanderthals, they are going to be pushed out of this area. They're going to be kind of pushed out, and that our lineage kind of goes down and sweeps through. But at some point, some of the groups stay up here in this upper area, and they're kind of stopped by the Natufian. And you can see right here in this area, right in this area right here, to get a little more clear
Now,
cut.
you
This will
know
be
what?
where the Natufian are, right there, then the Natufian. And then this will be another culture that was at the Zagros and the Caucasus that stopped.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't that A displaying the basal Eurasians? Wouldn't that basal Eurasian population give rise to the Natufian in turn, the Ibero-Maurusians? My question is, would that basal Eurasian population give rise to the Natufian culture?
And that's what we're going to talk about right now. That's a great question.
Okay, okay.
So first we got to start off in a culture that is kind of hard to pronounce. What is this? Um, cranial facial,
Yeah,
something like that.
craniofacial. Mm-hmm.
Craniofacial. The craniofacial dimensions of the skull suggest that these people were related to the contemporary people of Mali and how you said it, Maratina,
Yeah.
who in how you say that?
Yes,
More
Mauritania.
Mauritania, my bad, Mauritania, who in turn were related to. Now this is the group we're going to look at right here, the Mecha Ula, something like that. The Mecha Ula, something like that. People of the Maghreb. Now this is important because we're getting to the Maghreb, and the earliest settlers in Africa are in the Maghreb and they're in Morocco. So we're going to get a good understanding of the earliest ones in those areas. It says this concurs with uh, obviously observances about Eurasian haplotypes moving into the southern Sahara at ancient times, right? So mtDNA U and Y chromosome R1b, right? So let's talk about a movement of these. These people seem to have split off from the southern coral how you say it? I keep saying their name weird. Um, Cro
Yeah, Cro-Magnon.
Mangus. Magnon. Yeah, that's how you say it. Cro Magnon. There it is. The Southern Cro Magnon. A lot of people, they know what it is, but we'll get into the details of this. Cro Magnon about 30,000 years ago or more. So the Cro Magnon actually settled on upper northern Africa as well. We're going to look at that. But also have a minor affinity to Nubian populations, probably from Wadi Halaf northern expansion about 25,000 years ago, right? These people abandoned, they'll talk about this certain area that Goboro, they abandoned Goboro when the climate dried about 8,000 years ago, just to show real fast that source a little bit into some of these things. They just talk about burial and global, and they talk about pretty much certain cultures. Like a lot of people talk about this culture, and we're going to talk about them today too. The Kithvin culture, right? That's going to give us a little understanding of some movements into areas that's connecting Sahara and Nubia and things like that. So it's letting us know that it's going to be a culture that goes really far back, but it's going to tell us some things that is kind of important. because it's gonna give us some understanding. But notice how it's telling us that this line is Eurasian, right? Then E is gonna come. We're gonna note something when E comes in there. But this culture right here is this culture. Just talking about pretty much this culture that comes into. I'll just show you that it is going to be in Africa. Pretty much, it's gonna get a little bit of the culture, pretty much right there, Nigeria, desert of Nigeria, and everything. So it's gonna talk about an early culture. It is the site pretty much of these certain cultures right here. You can see when these other cultures come in. But let's get a little deep into it so we can get a little understanding on what's going on. So how do we know, with these certain haplogroups, how do we know what's their haplogroup? Here's one from Science Daily that's going to talk about one of the groups we just talked about, which is, as we have said right there, the Southern Cro-Magnon, right? And notice what it says right here. European ancestry, Cro-Magnon, 28,000 years ago, had DNA like modern humans. So it just let us know that he had DNA like modern humans, and it let us know pretty much what it is and everything. Let me just go over here and kind of just give the highlight of what it says. It just says basically Chris Darwin's Y chromosome was analyzed as part of the geographic project, right? Which is tracking basically the migratory history of humans. It shows he belongs to a male lineage, which is called pretty much haplogroup R1b, right? That's important to know because we know as other places that was talking about it, that Darwin was trying to, talk about it, this was a different culture and whatnot, but we found out it was modern humans. But we also found out it was not just modern humans, but it was ancient human that came from what was called a UST Isham. So it just talks about a little bit of that, about where it came from, like I said, areas of pretty much Eurasia to Africa, right? Why is that important? Because notice we haven't yet talked about E yet. That's going to come in and replace them. And it's important to know that R is not the first ones there. A is already there. We already spoke about this when we was talking about A00 migrating from Spain into Africa, and those dates were astronomical. We talked about those things when we talked about an out of Africa concept, and we're showing that Ham actually migrated into Africa as well, A and B. But this goes on and this talks about men belonging to R1b are direct descendants of Cro-Magnon people who, beginning 30,000 years ago, dominated the human expansion into Europe and basically say herald the demise of Neanderthals. But you got to be careful on this thing where it says that R1b destroyed the Neanderthals. Is rather the Neanderthals show that they was extinct at the same time and R1b expanded very quickly. So this just goes on a little bit of that. And that's why I was talking about the flood, the wiping out, and then the rise of these cultures, because we're going to note that they're going to be in areas of Africa a little bit, and they're going to be making some movements. So this just talks a little bit of that culture real fast. Let's go a little down because we want to get to the meat of the thing, but we got to get this build up before we get there. So again, what's important about this is that R comes from P, son of K M9, son of IJK, right? So IJK, remember, makes completely the R line and the J line together, T line as well. But let's go on a little understanding on the understanding of this, because this family first early splits and divides. As you can see, these early cultures and everything, when we think about this early culture, what's important to know is that Cro-Magnon is not one haplogroup. Though it is, we know that it is R1b, but we actually know that Cro-Magnon actually now stands for early modern European. That Cro-Magnon actually counts for pretty much a lot of different haplogroups, I's, C's, things like that. It'll be the group that splits from the IJK group from this area up here that actually would divide and rule in this upper area. But notice what's important about this is that I expressed this, right? And I talk about things from 2022. When we're talking about those sources on there and everything, we're talking about things that's still getting updated, and it's showing us ancient origins of the lines of Japheth. But remember, I talked about these flood layers. These layers is very important to understand. But what's also important to know about this culture, most of all, is that this is the same culture we was talking about that had went into areas of Africa, right? and not just Africa, but it had earlier divisions in the areas of Eurasia, right? It's going to split into areas of Eurasia and go into different cultures, right? So pretty much like right here, you see this one right here. I'm just going to click it, and you can see this culture right here is going to be a real culture, as all these cultures have idols, right? Because some people talk about the Natufians with their idols, but their idols look like Semitic idols. That's what's really interesting about them. But other ones have these weird idols. But notice something about this. This is a real culture. Notice what it says right here. Obviously, what's important is almost all the lineages, when they split, they have a BT, right? So BT splits, and you're going to have BTs, BTs, BTs until it makes your line of either DE or CF or A and B lines. What's important is when that CT splits, you're going to get from IJK its sons, right? So GHIJK, HIJK, IJK makes I, right? And J's and all those things. But this one is going to be found early still with some of his earlier lines of I's and C's, because C actually splits from F, as we see right there. They also had an example of F, which is makes every line underneath it. F-M89 is going to be one family. So this is a family of one family of Japheth. So it's going to be very important that they settle up in the north, but they're going to move and they're going to migrate early before the Natufian lines go down into the areas of Africa. I'm going to show you also that the Natufians, yes, majority of them say 14, 15, Asians are about that age. Iberians do not stretch ones that are.
Repeat what you just said, brother. You was in the Matrix.
All right, so I was saying that what I was saying. I'm gonna read this out. I'm gonna verify it pretty much. So it's talking about a previous culture, the culture that I was just showing with the R culture, and it was replaced by the culture that I was showing you with IJK. So basically, Japheth's line replaced also another culture that was previously there. That just lets us know that, remember, before the flood, Cain and Abel and Seth existed, right? All the way into Noah until the flood happened. And then the replaced lines that grow in those lands now are now going to be the lines of the people existing today. So we're going to start seeing people of today. So IJK, we found that culture after the Ice Age, and it replaced another culture that was up there. And we know that it talks about that was defined between 18,000 and 15,000 years ago. Now, if we proceed further, the thing that I was saying was that the Iberate, in fact, I'll show it in a quote as we go about it, and we constantly move about it and show it. So remember how I was showing that the core Mongol, or how you say that, the Coro Mongol, I keep saying a name weird. These people right here, these are actually going to be a name, as you see right here. They're going to be a name for any of those said Indo-European groups, as you can see right here from this source. Just to get a good understanding, let me just show you what I mean. Now, when I say Indo-European, understand what I'm saying. It's going to be the lines that become a majority of those groups. Rather, I'm going to say the lines of Japheth now to get a good understanding of the full understanding.
And we see that C is classified as a native or early European branch, which is mainly seen in the islands today amongst dark-skinned inhabitants. So that's just something to throw out there.
And it lets us know that the core Mongol people are actually descendants of the C and F groups. So you can see right there, and obviously I is a son too, which makes sense. But it lets us know a little bit different of the early Neolithic herders and farmers are going to be of some of the divisions of those G, H, and E. But what's interesting is that if we already confirmed that F makes a IJK, then we can actually confirm that F makes GHIJK and HIJK. That means that G and H is under F. So we can actually make that monophyletic. That's important to remember to find origins, to make it monophyletic. But what's not under F? E1b1b. We even confirmed that with a geneticist and different geneticists, that we confirm F does not make the E lineages. That means that F is not connected in a way producing E. So that's important. So if you ever see a F line older than E, and they say that it was their descendant, that means they don't not understand the separation between F and E. That F and E are totally different. That E, DE, has a Yap lineage. That's important. Remember, I spoke of that DE Yap lineage from that 2021 paper. That DE Yap is very important to cut the way of clarity of the monophylactic families. But F makes T, G, H. All these are going to be one family. We're going to note that as we go about it and move through. But that lets us know of the core Mongol that they are going to mainly be of those CF families, right? So just moving a little more down to get a little more understanding, just to get an understanding of the origin to make those Iberasians. So now, how did the Iberasians exist? Notice who came with those U6s. Those R groups. Well, let's see what it says a little bit about some of those U6s. For U6, by contrast, the corresponding increases in effective size were less marked, right? Just talks about some folds and everything, and just talks about some signals. I'm just going to skip down. This just talks about how long ago it was. It said 22,000 years ago, right? It just goes down and talks about some things. What's going to talk about? This coincides closely with the what? Beginning of the Iberasians. Now, wait, hold on. We got to understand something now. Was the Iberasians existing when the R and the U was already down there? Not yet. They're going to start beginning in the industry in the Maghreb. So it's very important. So they're going to get a trade-off, and they're going to pick up these U6s from these R lines that's moving from the area that, as remember we have talked about before, when they made their they made a cross section, they had crossed over. So right here, as you can see right here, this is going over it. Those R lines are the Eurasian lines. As it says, basal Eurasian, they'll say in these little areas. And I can show you this also. I'll show you this later on one of the Wikipedia things that they found some R's over there. But they moved and met with the Natufian and some of the Neanderthals, but they pushed the Neanderthals and they kept on attacking them up there. Is either they kept on attacking them or they kept expanding and stopped at some point when I and J kind of said, we're setting our bounds in this area. And R basically went down and looped around and came up through Spain on them. So that's gonna be important. But first, R is gonna push through, as you see here, but they met with some resistance, right? They met with some resistance, but that's where a decent amount is gonna settle up here. We're gonna look at that in a time. Most of them are gonna set up here, but some got through and mixed with some of the Natufian and moved with some of the Iberasians. We're gonna talk about them. We're gonna talk about where they actually moved from, right? We're gonna talk about this. Remember, look at this year. These Iberasians, the E of the Iberasians, are only, this is important, they're only 14,000 BP. That's important. Why is that important? Because on the out of Africa scale, we're going to see how that happens. How does that happen? How does the E actually move into Africa? Let's go about it and get a little understanding. These results, therefore, suggest that the Iberasians it just talks about a little bit of the expansion of modern humans and everything. Basically, it lets us know that they were ultimately Near Eastern, right? They were now again, right? What's that? Right? You got to understand that this is letting us know of the expansion of the modern humans were ultimately Near Eastern, carrying mtDNA haplogroup U6, who had spread into this culture right here. Now, U6 was where? In this culture before. That means U6 is actually older than the Iberasians because U6 was found 35 to 40,000 years ago and produced the what culture? Gabin industry. We're going to talk about the Gabin industry, and that's going to be the ones that we're going to get into. And link back to the Near East and the European early Upper Paleolithic, right? So it's going to get us some understanding of those things, but it's going to connect again still the Mesolithic Iberasians. May explain the suggested skeletal similarities between the robust Iberasians, the Makta, Aful, burial, and the European core Mongol remains, as well as the case for continuity of the bearers of Eurasian industry from Morocco with later North. Now watch what it says here with later. So when the Iberasians continue, they get a later, as it says, a later Northwest African population suggests by the dental evidence. So when they're looking at the fossils, they're saying that then E comes in and mixes with some of the U6 that had migrated, crossing through the Natufian culture. We're going to point out some things as we point out some things. And we'll point out some of those ages there.
Right, and something important to take away from this is it said that the Ibero-Maurusians were ultimately, Middle Easterner. Even if you take into the account their autosomal DNA, the Natufians make up a part of that as well. So these people would have been migrating from the Levant, Near East area into the Sahel, Northwest African regions.
That's right. That's absolutely right. So, and you can see this, we just went over that, the genetics, and that was right. Let's dive a little more into that. U6 spread into Africa. This first African expansion of U6A in the Maghreb was suggested in the previous analysis. Now, I'm going to show you something. I need to show you a note real fast. I got to open a note here. And I want to show you what was going on in the Maghreb. Because remember, though these are deep African ones, we got to also remember A is also going to be in the lands of Africa. But we're going to be talking about these lines here and what's really going on with these lines. So let me actually open up something and show you a fossil. When we had made this picture right here, right? Notice something right here. Notice something right there in that little corner right there. Let me see if I can get a little magnifying glass here. Notice something right here in that corner. What's going on right there? That actually is a Japhetic line. And that Japhetic line we had put on a fossil, and we showed that it went into Africa earlier than E1b1 went into Africa. And that's important to know, because when people are concluding E1b1 to be African, well, they probably aren't looking that deep, because there's no way it can be African if R is not African, right? If they say R is not African but Eurasian, then E1b1 and E must be coming from Eurasia, from the areas of basically the Levant. They have to be leaving the areas of the Levant when we look at the full picture. But let me show you this on this fossil here. Because we believe that Shem did start in the areas of the Levant. There will be no doubt that it would have some areas in around Arabia and things like that. We do believe that there's historical documents that hold it. There's enough evidence in the biblical text that also can prove it, that Shem would have a early tie to Semitic groups in the areas of basically what they call the Middle East. But first, let me show you something here from this paper here. Let me open up something and show you something. All right, so let me just open this up. So this is going to be a paper that I'm going to open that's going to give us some fossils that I like to use for giving understanding of real roots, deep roots, and some things that I think brings clarity. So this is going to be some fossils, and I'm going to go to a certain line here. Let me just, in fact, go to the Maghreb. Just need to find one of these that's gonna be it. It's a little lower down here. Just making sure I don't fly through it. All right, I see one of them. But as you can see, this one right here is gonna be an A group in this little area. So we're going to be connecting some connections from certain areas and everything. So this is an A group, right, in the lands of Africa. But what's interesting is, let me just see if I can copy. Hold on, my plus thing froze or something real fast. All right, there you go. I don't know why I just did that. All right. All right, so let me just pop this on here to show something here. And I'm going to show you how We also got, as you can see right here, in this deep area in Africa, we also got, as you can see here, some early R1b lines. But now these are not that early. The ones we got to find that's really early, we just got to go a little lower, right? So this one is going to be an early one. Just scroll down here to kind of point it out. I got one more here I got to point out on this. Let's see, where is that one? All right, here we are. I just want to put this here just so that this can be here. So notice some of the movements. Now notice this. This was important. The ones that I was showing are younger than what I'm going to show on this sheet. But what's important is later on, as these groups mix and mingle, remember, during the Tower of Babel, Japheth, Ham, and Shem, during the Tower of Babel, their sons were not divided yet. So their sons were not divided. So you'll find them in all types of different places, right? So that's important to note. But notice with this A, right? You can find it at this high age, like the ages we are talking about. You can see CT up there. You can see A's up there in Europe. So just to get a good understanding, self-consciously, real fast, after what I'm going to show you, they're gonna divide. So let's go about it to get a little understanding on this, to get a good understanding on the understanding of this. All right, so this source. But first, let me make sure what I was showing you real fast from this. You can see here, as we talked about the spread of it into the areas of Africa, into the Maghreb. All right, just gonna copy this because I'm gonna go to something on this. All right. So this is just a little summary of that, what we were just talking about and everything. It gives a little bit, but now let's get into the meat of it real fast. So this is gonna be, remember we was looking at that mtDNA real fast. As we can see that this is gonna be all U6 lineages, right? And it lets us know that during that time, a lot of it diversified. As you can see right here in Morocco, we got a lot in Morocco, a lot in this area in Morocco right here, also over here in this area. But notice we got some in the areas of the Levant too, and these areas. So we still got a lot of them in these areas, as well as we got some in these areas. So if we got these in these areas here, we got to also note when the E picks up this line, we're going to start seeing it in almost all those same areas. We're going to start seeing it pop up in all those same areas. But first, let's get a quick understanding of, again, which one was with those roots. Now you're going to find out who was actually with these ones right here real fast. One of the most important modern human movements was a Paleolithic backflow to Africa. Clear signals of this return were deduced from the phylogeny and phylogeography of the mtDNA haplogroup U6 and M1. So M1, U6, which show major North and East African distributions, right? This is gonna where it gets important. The genealogical and geographic distribution of at least 2 African branches of the West Eurasian Y chromosome haplogroup R and T, so RV88 and TM70, respectively. Remember what this note was called? Remember this note? What we're calling this note, right?
I also peeped the terminology. Just real quick, it said they named them African branches, but it said of the West Eurasian Y chromosome. So these right there, West Eurasian origin, but these are the African branches of it.
Isn't that interesting? Isn't it interesting that they got a Paleolithic link to Africa? E1b1a doesn't. I'm just saying.
Out of, out of
E1b1a has no Paleolithic or Mesolithic connection to Africa.
Correct. A lot of the information we have, there's definitely no link whatsoever that's been suggested thus far.
So let's keep on reading this. This is deep. This is really deep. So RNT, right? Who they call Eurasian, going into Africa. Well, they all the way in Paleolithic Eurasian. It says, watch what it says. Gave additional evidence for this back migration from a parental perspective. So that they're looking at the roots, they say, the fossils, primarily and secondary redactions of U6 branches with different basically ages when they talk about with different North African certain culture, pretty much. It just talks about certain culture. One of the cultures we'll look at is this one, the bean. We're gonna look at that and look Iberasians and the Caspian. So remember, U6 is moving throughout all these cultures. So that makes all these cultures Eurasian. That's important. And perhaps more prospectively, with the spread of the Eurasian language family. So now what's important is who moves the Eurasian language family in these cultures? The Iberasians and the Caspian. Why? Because the E group. We're gonna go to the root and we're gonna show you that the Natufians,
Afro-Asiatic, brother.
Afro-Asiatic, yeah. Who
And
moves
just
the
to add
Afro?
on to that, the solidify it even more, if we look at the Afro-Asiatic speakers today of North Africa, all of them, like all of them, their genetic makeup autosomally, and even from the Y haplogroup standpoint, stems from these Ibero-Maurusians, right? So that even goes to the fact more where it says that they could have spread the Afro-Asiatic language because the Amazigh Berbers, they speak Afro-Asiatic languages and they descend from these Ibero-Maurusian and Caspian cultures.
So this is letting us know where those Iberasians actually come from and spread the Afro-Asiatic family. So did Afro-Asiatic start in the areas of Morocco? They already have Afro-Asiatic. But let's read a little more into it. So they just go on. They say, just talks about some cultures that exist between 40 to 20,000 years ago. Notice that, remember, there's still no E's yet. We'll talk about when that E pops in. We'll talk about it directly, pinpoint when it pops in, when that E pops in. We're going to get it by its exact Y chromosome. But notice we haven't talked about it yet. But it says studies on Iberasian remains with an age around, they say around 20, this old, about 12,000 years ago. They just talk about some of those at the site of this site. Now, notice the name of this site. This site right here is going to be where we first find E. But notice it says it's only 12,000 years ago that we first find an E there in this certain site. We're going to talk about that. In this analysis, haplotype, they just talk about different haplotypes right here. These, they say Eurasian mtDNAs were found. And they say right here, obviously evidence of the populations continuing also in Africa. It says, on the other hand, watch what it says here about the other hand. Only one haplogroup harbored, they say, this certain mutation. So it's saying that this mutation, this lineage that I'm going to show you is different than those lineages. It says, which if assigned to an L haplogroup, so mtDNA L, would represent a sub-Saharan African influence about 4%. So saying like, oh, it's like 4% there. So it still has a connection with that group, right? This would equate to a frequency 5 times lower than that found in current Moroccan populations. It says, and would support the proposal that the penetration of sub-Saharan mtDNA lineages, watch what it says here, to Africa mainly occurred since the beginning of the when? In the Paleolithic, like these ones? No. In the Haliocene. So it's saying that L lines got into Africa actually later than these mtDNA lines. It's basically saying M1 and U6 is more African than even the L lineages. This is what it's saying there. It's saying that even that L lineage it came there during the Haliocene, and it migrated backwards into Africa. We're going to talk a little more about some of these things because that's going to be in connection to the sisters of E. But going a little more into it, watch what it says here. Going into the study of Moroccans. So even the Moroccans admit it. Even on the study of the Moroccans, they admit this same study. The genetic study published in January 2012 stated that indigenous North West African ancestry appeared most closely related to populations outside of Africa, but divergent between Moroccan people and Near Eastern Europeans likely precedes the Haliocene, they'll say 12,000 years before present, and the Paleolithic. So it's letting you know about some of the Moroccans, that some of their lines, right? Some of the lines that's supposed to be down there, they say that they go all the way back. But notice other studies would let you know that R and T, which remember that those was down there first, and some of these lineages would be actually Eurasian. But then you'll see that in certain places they'll say, oh, that they're actually African. But then watch what we go a little more into some of the evidence of that exact that time. It's a little ahead of it. Evidence of Neolithic migration from Near East is supported by the introduction of domestic animals like cows, sheep, goats to North Africa, but the indigenous development of ceramics in North Africa by the year 9000, right, is suggestive of and basically form a pretty much and which say basically form of agriculture or pastoralism, right, prior to any domestic diffusion from the Near East. So that's
go ahead.
so this is actually kind of interesting, because what it's talking about is letting us know. In fact, I think, Will, you had pointed out something like this, that the culture, when the culture migrates, when one culture we know is settled in one place and migrates to another place, we know that that's a movement. That's something that's moving. And that's what they say. We identify a graduate of likely, how you say that, out of Chapanese,
Yes.
Maghrebi ancestry that increases from east to west across northern Africa. So now this is important. It's coming from the east of Africa to the west of Africa. That means it was on the east of Africa going to the west, going over to the Maghreb, which is on the west. So it was starting in the east. What was in the east area? And it says this ancestry is likely derived from back to Africa gene flow more than 12,000 years ago, right? Just going on those things.
Keep reading that. Read that next sentence. It says the indigenous North African ancestry is more frequented in populations with historical Berber ethnicity. Like I said earlier, not only does this connect to the Berbers, it also connects them with Afro-Asiatic populations by way of the Ibero-Maurusians.
There it is.
Right, because again, like it said, like the note you brought out, it said that they brought in agriculture and pastoralism. We know that EP2 and Afro-Asiatic languages is associated with pastoralism and agriculture. And even fact, right here, I'm finna finish up real quick. And even right here, it makes a great point. It says we identify a graduate of likely autochthonous Maghrebian ancestry that increased east to west across northern Africa. If you going east and west across northern Africa, that sounds like movement between the Levant and Africa to me. It solidifies it. Correct. It solidifies it by even saying this ancestry is likely derived from back to Africa gene flow more than 12,000 years ago. So this was Levantine related ancestry coming into North Africa associated with pastoral and agriculture, which it then gave rise to the Afro-Asiatic Berbers.
That's right. That's right. That's right. He's getting right to it. In fact, we just had a Berber the other day. Didn't he bring out this little thing the other day and talk about what he said, that was an E1. He said that was an E lineage in this culture. Right. But we did not find this is what we're doing today. We found T and R in that culture. We did not find E in that culture. And in fact, going a little more into it, just to show that's supposed to be a how you say, a phenotype, a genetic phenotype of this culture that we were just talking about, of those hunter and gatherers. What's important is Europeans were hunter and gatherers for a long time. In fact, the Iron Age was earlier in Africa because they were more advanced and more of a more set society than Europe was for a long time. And that's just a true fact, that in Europe, they didn't have iron soon as Africa has iron. So it's something important to know, that they had a Stone Age a longer time. So it looks like a long time. But let's get a little understanding. This is just a reconstruction of that Metro flu hunter based on the said that fossil, that 35,000 fossil that they found there and everything. That it says, in fact, you can see in the background of this picture, to let you know in the background of this picture, in the background is a Cro-Magnon man. So you can see what's going on there, saying that he goes back 35,000 years ago as well. So it's letting you know that they look fairly similar, pretty much. It's like they probably was fairly related, the same. In fact, we can see that others had talked about this. It says many talk about this. Western Europeans with R1b are Metra Aflu, right, from Northern Africa and Spain, right? So they talk about that. There's others that had talked about these things, right? A lot of people talk about these things, whatnot. They go into these little conversations. But let's get a little more dive, because as he's speaking, as Will's speaking, he's getting right to what we're about to lead into when we're going to talk about that coming in of these groups. So you can see we're taking the time getting pinpoint into it. It says remains from earlier periods suggest that the Metra Aflu population was a stock indigenous to the northwestern Africa. So they say they're indigenous to Africa, right? There's one, as we see, is a related form. It just says, and restricted to the western and central Sahara during the last 10,000 years, and are considered a North African branch of Cro-Magnon man. So remember, Cro-Magnon is supposed to be that European groups that went down and everything. So this just goes a little bit into it. 2021, just letting you know a summary of some things of them, right? Let you know that they have a connection with these ones and these ones. Just let them know that there's still those European groups that settled in Africa, but they're not called African, even though some places call them African. So think about those ages, though, as we would look at those little younger ages of Eve. But let's keep on going. Watch it says, yet this is going to be something. Yet the child's Y chromosome belonged to a genetic group called Y haplogroup R, is mitochondria DNA to U. Today, those haplogroups are found almost exclusively in people living in Europe and regions of Asia West, and these certain mountains, these mountains right here. I don't know exactly where these are. In fact, I usually open up a Google map. So, I mean, Earth, to get a little look of these real, right, material cultures, right? But remember what I showed earlier with those years on flood layers and all those things. It's important to know, just because they find them in a certain layer does not mean that they're exactly that. But these are going to be BC cultures. So these are going to be ancient times to tell us what's going on, if someone wants to put it on the scale. So it's saying also up here. So let us know some far distances there. So let us know about these cultures and everything. Just gonna close some of these because got a little bit open here, and we'll need all those. Got a little too much open. Yeah, we'll leave that there. Okay, so as you can see, what it let us know about those lines, that they reach all the way even over here, and they have connections, right? They stop about here. We had talked about it before, and then they go down. They cross through the Natufian, right? Some settle here, still trying to go at it with the Natufian, but they can't get through because the Natufian are super strong. And we had talked about that before, that the Natufian were making wars down here. But they were moving with those ones, and they were going through, and they settled over here. So that's very important. So they're going to be settling in these areas and up here, going up here. So they actually are going to combine and going to kind of move together at some points. We're going to talk about that as they combine and move through some of these cultures and everything to kind of take over. But at that time, at that same time, while the R and the E moves, I and J, and there's certain groups, T, and there's other groups that's bounding together in these areas here that's trying to keep certain cultures out. But if you know already, E and R does some damage in sometimes, if you know about like the battle axe culture and stuff like that. But let's get a little understanding on these roots real fast on this one. So as you can see, it just lets us know that it has connection to Russia, China, and Mongolia. And then now we're going to talk about this culture here. The Daban is clearly related in some way to the broadly contemporary, this is the Paleolithic ones, and the ones in also in the Near East, they say, and with backbladed or backed blades, right? And certain things that they found, like Brezin and what's that? Something in there's scrapers. That probably copied weird. Being its most characteristic artifact. So it just talks about also some movements of, this is important too. It just lets us know of those that group, right? This is just going to be a group. Notice that year right there, that end year. Now, this is where we're going to find soon the Iberasians come in right after this culture, right? Now, what's interesting about this culture is that this culture, like they say it came from Europe and the Near East. But notice it was there 40,000 years ago to the 1400s. Now, who's going to replace them in the 1400s? What culture I said that pops up in the 1400s? Let's find out. It's going to be a culture that's going to replace them and it's going to take their women's. So let's look at what's going to happen here. It says, thus, several extent as exact Mediterranean birds. This is going to talk about certain species that's going to make movements. Why this is important, we're going to talk about what's going to happen. It just talks about, pretty much make this summary short, it's just talk about bird species migrating, right? Bird species migrating pretty much across the land in certain cultures, right? Getting entwined with certain cultures, right? And that lets us know, the reason why that's important, because it lets us know of certain ties of cultures and what they had with them and what species were around them. This one I'm just going to skip. That's just extra. But I'm going to read this part right here. So firstly, they most probably evolved. They just talk about from certain cultures. The one that I'm going to talk about right here. Not being, basically, I'm going to skip a little down to this next part right here, where it's going to talk about U6, where it talks about the phase with U6. It's going to talk about the band is a local industry in this area here that I need to show real fast. Maybe I could show it on this. It's in Libya.
Yeah, it's modern day Libya.
Yeah. They're not going to show the ancient one. I'll show this real fast. So this is basically in Libya, if you can see right here. But what's important about it is about this area of Libya. In fact, it's right there. You can see it right there. It's gonna be about this area of Libya. So before they get over here, right? Before the E gets over here, you're gonna note something about this culture here. You're gonna note something that's gonna happen with this culture right here. So we're gonna get a little understanding of its earlier movements before even the Iberasians of E get that E1b1b. So it just talks about, obviously, they're gonna have some information. It just talks about some things. I'm just gonna click this and just show a little bit what it's talking about before we talk about the E. So this is just talk about the history of North African mitochondria DNA haplogroup U6 gene flow into Africa, Eurasian, and they say American continents. So they go into a lot of different places. Because remember, they had split all the way up here in the north. So remember that they was all the way over here, but they split even from over there. We're working our way to it. We're getting right to the culture because it's gonna get some. When we get back to this note, you'll know what's going on. But first, we got to understand these things real fast. All right, so that culture right here, what's important is the band, that culture in that little area I was talking about in pretty much upper Africa, closer to where we get basically Egypt, is before the Iberasians. So it's important that this culture is going to be before the Iberasians, just to get a little understanding here on something. I'm going to skip this one. This is an interesting controversy. So here we go. Let's get a little understanding of what's happening here. So it says, further debate had focused on the question of population replacement in the late Paleocene and Haliocene. The earliest Upper Paleolithic industry in North Africa is the band. So that's the earliest, right? Is any E in that the band group? No. But we got R's and we got T's around there. Limited, right, to this area right here, limited to this area. So it's letting us know where is it limited at. That certain area that we had showed right here. So it's limited to over here, right? So still early on is right in that area. That's going to be important for the read. A likely glacial refuge area. So why glacial refuge? Because we'll talk about the ice age, right? So it's getting some refuge from all those ices and everything, the glaciers. And most likely, they say dating from, remember that long time ago, 36 to 50,000 years ago, right? Its similarities to Near Eastern Upper Paleolithic industries have suggested an origin in what? In the Levant, rather than local in the wherever this is right here, rather than local to here. So that's important. How did he get some ties to the Levant? Watch what they tie with, because remember who I said it crossed through. And similar blade industries have been found further south by 30,000 K, right? The band were what? The band were replaced by the Eastern Orient, right? Or Eastern Iberasian, right? In this area. When did they replace them? Possibly, they say as early as 18 KA. Did they? Right? Which ones replaced whom? Right? That's what we're gonna look at. By which time the Upper Paleolithic had expanded eastward for the first time along the coastal belt of the Maghreb, which the Iberasian or Orian, I don't know how you say that, Orion, the origins of which are similarly controversial. Why is it controversial? Because they're younger. They're not older than those R groups. They're younger than them, especially as it appears earliest in the Northwest. Because who was earliest in the Northwest? Who's the earliest culture we just seen?
Yeah, that's a great connection showing that population replacement from those early Cro-Magnon populations or that the Bond population by the Ibero-Maurutians. I wasn't aware of that, so that's a nice connection.
That's deep. That's real deep, and a little more to it. A mitogenome, they say 30-fold coverage of a certain individual, and one from Romania, and says we present in this article. They just talks about a modern human and everything. I'm just gonna skip down. They also know that it has connections to also Neanderthal. They say, and they say we identify. We had talked about this. This is just that U6. When we talked about, yes, the U6 is pretty much Eurasian. That they say basically had a recent gene flow from Africa, right? But they actually flow into Africa as they go on and say the presence of the basal haplogroup U6 in Southeast Europe. So they say 1 in 35,000 years before present confirms a Eurasian origin of the U6 mitochondrial lineage. So that means if you find any son of U6, they're Eurasian. So any son born of a woman of U6, because a man can't get, no matter, though a man comes from a man can't give birth to a man. So a man needs a woman to mate and bring forth that one. So you got to explain, how do they meet? And this is how they met. They met migrating into Africa, right? Makes sense, because the biblical narrative, they got off the ark and they migrated into Africa. We're going to talk about some of the ancient origins. So let's talk about, remember how I was showing these ancient ages of these 35,000, all that stuff, all that. We can see right here, if we look to the Iberasian culture and we try to find E, notice something interesting about some of these cultures here. See this ancient culture here, some early cultures that are going to be in some of those areas. These are just some of the early areas. We can see the mtDNA. These are going to be some of those said Indo-European mtDNA. It's going to close that, and I'm going to open this one now. And this one's going to be Morocco. So notice the areas of Morocco in these areas. Note the mtDNA. So these are going to be some Eurasian mtDNA. So we can see for the higher ones up, but then a population comes there, tampered with from somewhere else. And then, as we see right here, in this 114,000, this time frame right here, this one mixed with that U6, also with the M1. So you can see we was talking about that M1 and U6 just earlier. And this E group, now let's find out where this E group came from. Now, do we have an earlier E than this one, than 14,000? Not only do we have the Natufian that stretched that high, we also have a fossil of one a little earlier in Eurasia. But first, let's talk about this Natufian. Natufians reached 39,000 years ago, right? That migrated to Africa. So this is important. What culture was they in at first? If you've seen the Hebrew of Israel, he spoke about this culture before. This one, how you say that? Kabara. That's where the Natufian actually pops in within this culture. And there is a one find of that Natufian, and I'm going to read it. It says right here in Cell, it was in 2021. It's going to be the genomic history of the Middle East. And it lets us know the haplogroup common in Natufian, E1b1b, is also frequent in our database, right? With most lineages coinciding basically the normal Natufian lineages, where you say the one's 12,000, but you'll say 8,000 years before present. That's be 8,000 years before present, but rather it'd be like 12,000 long time ago, right? Some older ones than these ones. Although we also find a rare deep divergent Y chromosome, which correlates 39,000 years ago. So you see how long ago that Natufian is in the Middle East. So let's go a little get a little understanding real fast on some things real fast. Thus, about 2/3 of the Iberasian DNA was related to contemporaneous populations from the Levant, the region on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea, north of Arabian Peninsula, and south of Turkey. It includes Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and the Palestine territories, and Syria. That's from DNA reveals Stone Age North Africans had Near Eastern and Sub-Saharan ancestry. Seeker. A little more.
Exactly. And real quick, that's just showing again that they indeed would have been back migrating from the Levant into North Africa, especially with that autosomal component that they showed out up there with
That's
all
right.
those groups in the Near East.
That's right. And you see, it seems like a lot of sources, but look, we're almost done. This is where the cutoff is right here. This last few right here. All right, so let's get a little understanding on what's going on here. So they did a sequence on some humans, and they found out that almost all of them belong to M1 and U6, right? And it said obviously they revealed predominantly North African clade arose in southwestern Asia and moved together to Africa about, they say 40,000 to 45,000 years ago. So remember, these lines are going to have those lines in them. They're going to have these lines in them. So you can see here, they're going to say that they're going to return. They actually came from the Levant. So upper early Paleolithic to Africa. So they're going to move to Africa, but they came from the Levant. Who they meet in the Levant. Now, what's the oldest E? Notice how I showed you with those Iberasians. What's the oldest on those? Here's the oldest E. The oldest E is in Eurasia. Here's how I pointed out a while back on a paper. It looks kind of blurry. I'll open it up on a note right here. I'll just show you where this is coming from. So here's the note. Remember how I was talking about the early ice age and all that stuff? So this is going to be traces of genetic origins of European farmers, right? Because after Noah, they became farmers. That means Ham, Shem, and Japheth went to different areas. Their sons went to different areas, and we caught one of Shem's sons. I want to talk about real quick how we caught one of Shem's sons with some of the lineages of the women that was up in the north. Just like how we caught some with the women up in the south, right? So let's take a look here, right here. So we got one. Let's make sure this is earlier than those Iberasians, right? Is this going to be earlier than the Iberasian groups that we were just looking at earlier? Notice the Iberasians only 14,000 years ago. Well, this E that you're going to see here is between 16, just to get it clear that this is the E right here. This E right here is between 15 and 16,000 years ago. That means the Iberasians did what? Where's this actually coming from? I pointed out before and everything. Let me just copy this. What happened, right? They left out around the areas of Mount Ararat and they diversified and went to different areas. They split. They went into different areas. Some went this way, some went that way, but Japheth mostly went north, right? Some went south, though. That's going to be important that some went south, but we got to know what's who by the monophyletic family, right? That's going to be very important. Let me put this right here. All right, remember, that's why I was showing you IJ was found up in the north. Here's where the earliest E is found. So where did that E come from? He came from Mount Ararat, split from here. And after Babel, the time of Babel happened and everything, the people came together and God divided the languages, and then the Natufian was the one that picked up the Afro-Asiatic language family, and that was after the divisions of Babel, and Shem would be settling in these areas until later replacements and invasions in those areas. It's going to be very important, but this is going to be your earliest E. It's Eurasian. This line is actually Eurasian. It came from somewhere else. And this is, I mean, one of the earliest ones, but this is just important. We can get deeper into D, but I just want you to understand this real fast, that the Berbers, this is going to be the ultimate origin. Just understand the presence of two underived E-M96 Saudi lineages raises interesting questions related to the micro haplogroup DE-YAP. Follow geography, right? The recent resolution of CDEF M168, which is basically CT M168. It's a CT branch. And it just talks about pretty much that it makes the DE-YAP group and it makes the CF P143, right? So it makes Shem and it makes Japheth, right? So it's letting you know the separation of these two lines. It says extends the conversation regarding the early successful colonization of Asia. Going on. It says this proposes, what does it propose? The successful colonization of Eurasia by migrants of populations containing, right, predecessor Y chromosome founder. Who's the founder? Remember, we talked about Noah. CDET. That's basically CT. It's just basically, as you can see, if you take away the middle part, it's basically CT, pretty much. It's basically a CT lineage. So it's CDET, which is actually that CT lineage, M168, and basal MTL3. So that's important. This is important because if L3 is a sister, right? If L3 is a sister of Shem, then she would have popped up about the time of the Neolithic time. Well, that's interesting because the first time we see L3 is at Tel Halula by fossils. Tel Halula, Syria is actually the first time we find L2.
That's regions.
That's a fact. That's a fact. These are the children of the flood, after the flood. Regions near the near but internal to Northeast Africa, like the Levant or Southern Arabian Peninsula, could have served as an incubator for the early diversification of non-African, right? Non-African uniparental haplogroup varieties like Y chromosome DE-YAP, CFP143, and those mtDNA M and N, which we were looking at M1, and under N, you're going to see that U6, that they also went to Africa too, just like L's went to Africa. But notice that we seen that CT was with L, and that was in Eurasia. That was in an area, as it says, in the areas of Eurasia. But notice it says these would have spread globally and diversified over time and space. This model would imply that both CFP143 and DE-YAP evolved mutated nearby, but outside Africa, right? So they let you know some of those ancestors that's found, they found some, obviously some in Africa, right? They found some in Africa, but they found some also in Asia, just like we talked about before. One DE-YAP ancestor would have spread to Asia and evolved to D, while another DE-YAP returned to Northeast Africa and evolved into haplogroup E. It is noteworthy that haplogroup DE-YAP has been detected in low frequencies in Africa. Now let's get one more understanding of the first source that we were talking about. Now you see, while we was talking about this, while we was going over the information on these things, when we was talking about what's happening with pretty much these ultimate sources and everything on what's happening over here and everything, just to get a good understanding. Let me point it out real fast. because I want to make sure point out this source. I think I just flew right by it up here. All right. Just to do a quick summary of what we just said, and then I'll point out the source real fast. Let me make sure to see, because I think one of the brothers was saying that he needs things to be explained real fast and make sure everyone's all caught up and everything. Amen, amen. All right, so let's quickly summarize what's going on here. So what do we just summarize? And then we're going to talk about Bronze Age, Iron Age. This is just an introduction. All right, so these are going to be the roots. What did I just show you? I showed you that T haplogroups, and maybe I didn't show that yet. Show me your oldest E1b1a you can find, and I'll show you a T that's older than it. All right, that's just one. We got some other ones that's older than it. So T is actually old in Africa and R past E1b, all the E groups. Right, but let's go over the summary of what we just found out. R was replaced. Now remember, A and B are the Hamites. They were in Africa first, but then Japheth goes there, then later Shem. So R1b was replaced in Africa by E1b1b only after 14,000 BC, 14,000, right? Pretty much by the scientific scale that scales hundreds of thousands of years, right? Or more. Yet E is younger. E is young as RT, pretty much. Probably got to phrase that right. Pretty much the R haplogroup is in Africa, and then E1b1b replaces that one in Africa. T haplogroup is also older in Africa than E1b1a, right? So T haplogroup are found in Africa, Morocco, Neolithic, before any Bronze Age E1b1as are found, which those actually come from the E1b1s of the Natufian. It's important to understand because none are found, no E1b1a is found Mesolithic, Paleolithic, right? The Neolithic ones are in Eurasia. That's important to know. But this is what we talked about. We talked about how the U6 lineages were with those Eurasian lineages and they migrated down. Some of those U6 got a trade-off to a lineage of different lines than the R group. And they had got with some of those other IJK sons. But they had moved, some of those ones mutated and became U5s and all those other different ones as the U lineage had mixed with these IJK groups. That one sweep through, the U6 sweep through and caught a ride with some ancient Natufians. Those Natufians left and they settled in this area right here where you see U6A. So they settle in this area where U6A is, but they also start to go up here and settle in these areas. That's why they call them basically a connection of the word Spain, right? Ivory, right? Iberusians. You'll get a good connection of where they're at. But we know that they connect with the not the Natufian, earlier than the Natufian culture, which are the Kabara culture. So that's important to know about this culture, right? They're going to be settled in that area. So that sweeps through. Some pick that up, that U6, and they settle over here. So some pick up that U6 that sweeps through and settles over here, right? That's going to be very important. And those ones are going to be settled in that area. And we know that we went over a couple of different information of different groups. We talked about how old R and T is in some of these lines and everything. And we were showing how the IJK groups was in a lot of these ancient lines and everything. I'm going to skip down a little bit to some meat where I want to go to. And then we talked about some things of the U6 that actually got mixed in with those Eurasian groups and with some of the ones of the African groups. They say African, that actually would be Eurasian in origin by fossils. We talked about how they migrated into the areas of the South. We talked about how they diversified, and a lot of them are settled in Morocco. That's why a lot of Moroccans have M1 and U6 and different lines like that. And that line would also be Eurasian, so they would be all over these different areas. They are not only Africans, right? If you find anyone with U6 or M1, tell them they are not only African. And then you see we had talked about some deep information right here when we were going over the information of pretty much those lines that I was showing you right there. So this just goes over pretty much those gene flow and everything. And then we had talked a little bit about some of the genetics of the Moroccans, how they're mixed. They're a mixed group, very mixed and everything. But they know that, like they even say, that their lines are going to go back at least to some of the Eurasian lines that actually going to be having a back migration into the lands of Africa. As I say right there, the Moroccans and Near Eastern like basically came, they say 12,000 years ago. So they say. And then we had talked about some other things right here. This was just talking about the animal movements and everything, how the animals also make them Eurasian, how we know that they support a back migration, that the animals also show that the Moroccans, as it says 12,000 years ago, had also animals moving with them. They show a back migration and everything. And we looked at the culture that was previously there. They show that they were not E groups. We had talked about that they were R groups and Eurasian groups. That's where that E picked that up from. And we had talked about right here, maybe I'm point this out, maybe no, we don't need to point this out. Those are just different of those cultures, which they remember they ultimately come from UST Isham, which was a K group, which KM9 connects T and R, but IJK is going to be the father of all those. So that's going to be very important. And this one we had talked about, this is just talking about migrations and everything from different cultures. We had talked about that. And we talked about a little bit of some other cultures and everything and whatnot. So those are going to give us about the Eurasian M6, the U6 and the M1 lines that were moving from the south, going down into areas of Africa, settling into areas of Africa, and then replaced by the Iberusian groups. They're going to be replaced by the Iberusian groups that come in, but you got to know them by their fossils. And their fossils are going to tell us that the replacement is going to happen after the Natufians that actually show an older age than those groups. So the Natufian groups are actually going to show older ages, that they were there longer in the areas of the Levant. And not only that, we also have evidence that the Iberasians themselves are actually from the Levant. And we also have evidence that the ultimate E groups are actually Eurasian, that they're actually going to be settled in the areas of Eurasia by their fossils. So, and we had also point out the roots, that the roots show that they're also Eurasian. So with that, we can look at, like we had talked about before, this is the source I wanted to point out. We're going to come back to this note, and me and Will's going to build off of this note. This is the one I was talking about when I was pointing out the one from 2021, when I was telling you exactly this. Let me say it one more time. A group of people with Yap insertion migrated from South Asia to Central Asia and reached the Mediterranean. So remember, they're migrating from South Asia to Central Asia. So if you know what that means like far South Asia would say like far Asia. So like South Asia, right? South Korea, all that stuff, Japan. And then going to Central Asia, center of Asia, where we have Asia, and then where do they go? To the Mediterranean, as we see there, and Mesopotamia as well. And we can see right here, and reach the Mediterranean. So it's not that they came from Africa to there, but they came from Japan going into Africa, because out of Africa concept is not true. They gave rise to the E lineage. As previous papers were saying, as they keep on trying to deny. The mutation at M40 and M, remember we talked about that early root line that we were talking about on this one over here, right? That early M60, right? That's what this is talking about right here, EM60, right? Saudi Arabian lineage, right? EM60, Saudi Arabian lineage. Goes on and lets you know about that mutation that E had got. The E lineage got a mutation on that EM60. The E lineage dispersed to Africa, Middle East, Southern and Eastern Europe. Lineage E1, which is going to make your E1b1a lineage, which we believe is Israel. The lineage E1 is predominant over entire Africa, right? But was it there in the fossils? Was it there a long time ago? No. But now it dominated the land now, right? Because it became an Iron Age culture, and it ruled Africa with Iron Age tools. Why? Right? We gotta talk about that too. And at a lesser frequency in the Middle East and Europe, right? This back migration of people to Africa through the Levant is supported by studies that were happening throughout all time, even in 2018, until they try to pull out a modern D0. You ever seen that? When they try to use a modern D0 to say, oh, by using a modern person, this line must be African.
Yeah, they love to use living people as samples.
Isn't that odd? So remember that. Note that fossils are different than modern peoples. So that's very important. So fossils are not told by modern peoples. Modern people tell modern events. Fossils tell us ancient events. So yat plus E. So remember that yat plus insertion, that allele. So yat plus E migrated back to Africa with other Eurasian haplogroups. Wasn't we talking about that? Such as R1b, right? Saying 18 to 30 to 29,000 years ago. And the lineage T, right? Look how old that one is, going back a long time ago, which has been observed in high frequency in northern Cameroon and in high frequencies in Africa. That was a 2021 source right there. So very, very important. It's going to give us the genomic diversity in people of India, focus on mtDNA and Y chromosome polygenism. So how you say that, right? Get deep into those facts and those sources. Very, very, very deep. So now we can get into where we're going to get into the Bronze Age. So I'll just do a quick, slow introduction, and it's not going to take long. Just to get to about right here, and then Will is going to take over, because then we're going to talk about the Bronze Age cultures of E that comes in and everything. So let me just do a quick summary of this. So now that you got that part understood, any questions before we proceed? Family, any questions? If you got any questions, maybe if you don't understand one of those things real fast, I hope that summary helped with that breakdown, brother. And if I have missed something or didn't make it clear, hopefully I made it clear. So that little end summary was the summary of it all. That we just looked at was fossils, though it took a little bit. That was the full picture of it. Now you can say it has been done. All right, so evidence of a loop from Babel to Levant to Europe, back around Levant till about 3000 BC, arrival in Africa again. Does that sound complex? Let me show you what's going on, what I'm saying. So they're going to start after the flood. This is basically what happened. Let me just zoom out. If you know the biblical story, right? If you know the biblical story, Adam has his sons. They populate the earth. There's a global wipeout. The people start out about here. They come out. They settle in a lot of different areas. And then Nimrod says, hey, come to Shinar and let's build us a tower. They go to Shinar. And remember, early cultures were actually very small. And they came to Shinar, but God saw what happened. He divided their language and then breaks the first lingua franca, right? Early lingua francas like Sumerian stuff that was broken, and then other languages started to increase. We know because Sumerian reached even all the way to Peru. We talked about that before, when the language of Sumerian reached all the way there. They had an early lingua franca. But afterwards, the Semitic language became a language. The Semitic language, the earlier languages that would slowly become Indo-European or Indo-Iranian. So Indo-European, Indo-Iranian is one family. That's important. And then the Semitic languages will come from Shem, which will have connections to here. And he would also have connections a little bit going up here, but he goes down, because we know the Joktanites, they go down into these areas over here. And we also know they go and have connection with Spain, because we also know the Natufian have connection to Spain because they have seashells from Spain. That's important to know about too. But this is a quick summary of what the biblical narrative is actually expressing. But let's go about it. So this is actually something from Science America. This is what they found out. So what's important to know about, in science, the flood event happens about what they call the Younger Dryas, right? They can call it what they want, but it's about that time of 12,000, based on the scientific scale. When you look at the fossils and stuff, that there was evidence of a global water increase of flooding and a global bottleneck that happens about that time. Now, if you ask me, like I went over those layers, that this would happen about the biblical time frame. But if we got to go about the scientific scale, let's go about it the scientific scale for a second. All right. So remember how we talked about Noah was a what? He was a pastoralist and he was agriculturalist because he actually had animals, right? He knew how to take care of the animals, and he had the ability of sowing his own field and having wine. So agriculture evolved in the Middle East, they say roughly 11,000 years ago, to 9,000 BC and everything. And they know that it moved all the way up to Europe and other places and everything. So that picture would look like this. So they'll say about 10,000 years ago, it will start about in this area right here. And then it's spread out. So it'll slowly spread out to different areas. As time goes by, it'll stretch out. And that's how you get some settling as Iberasians, because as they go out and they settle out, they had connections with early sons of Ham, Shem, and Japheth. They were all together at first into the division. We also know that Shem's women that we had connections to, we had connected those L lines. We noticed that they went down into Yemen, right, from Arabia. Because remember, we talked about the earliest ones was in Tel Halula. So they was around this area. So as we know, early culture started around here. And it says they seen that the Yemenis mitochondrial genome suggests multiple migration events with Africa and Western Eurasia. So very important that we had noted before when we're going to note these things. So we're going to note what it's saying here. So it just lets us know pretty much some things. I'm just going to read the summary of what it's saying. It just says this about the Yemeni haplogroups of the Paleocene. It says basically L3s. So L3s of different SNPs. Remember those M1s we was talking about? And some N1 groups. So M1s, N1s, right? Those are going to actually go, as it says, they actually go into the Horn of Africa, right? Through Southern Arabia. So we can note which ones, those L3s, M1s, right? Ns, they're going to go into Africa to Southern Arabia. So 29 to 7,000 years ago, they say. It says 5 haplogroups and whatnot. They just say which ones migrated into Yemen. They say L0, some L3. So they're moving around. So as these ones go there, they're moving around. So it will be just like this. They'll go down. Some will go through here, up. Some will go through here, down. So they're moving into these areas. So they're going down and they're moving into those areas. So people are making movements. That's very important. Why? Because if you also know the river that was still of Eden was the river that we see that they call the Nile, which is actually the Nile is actually a Greek name for that river, right? Nile is not what the Egyptians were calling it. It's important. Early finds of broom mullet in Yemen and Sudan predate evidence for overland adoption in Mesopotamia and Egypt, suggesting a similar maritime route once the crop reached Southern Asia. So this is important to just let us know that places of India and Africa had connections, right? Here's just something for the mental understanding while we go over this, is letting you know that this area here had connections here and it had connections here. So just because someone goes in Africa doesn't mean they only was in Africa. It means that they're migrating and getting the goods. And they're crossing this area and they're going over to India. And look at these dates to get a good understanding that they're going all the way back for some of the movements there. So it's even here, going over here. So that's very important to get some understanding. But they have migrated from here. As you can see, different ones going down and then going up and around. So they're going all around these areas. And let me make sure I plug in my thing. So this took a little longer than I thought.
Some important information.
It's something important, and I've been waiting to go over this because I was going to do it on your live, but I think your live was very nice and concentrated on what needed to be talked about. I think that was a great live what you did.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know where I put my little charger. I have to look for it real fast, but I'm gonna go down a little more, and then I'm gonna hand it off to you while I look for my little charger. But you can see right here again a little more L3. We had talked about it before. I just put information here if you want to see the roots of L3. The L3 starts to Tel Halula. These are fossil notes. Geographic origins and dispersion of mtDNA L haplogroups, right? Just talk about the movements of L groups, remember we'll talk about that, inside Africa, and exit of L3, predecessor to Eurasia. It says return to Africa and expansion to Asia of basal L3 lineages with subsequent basically differentiation in both continents. It says geographic ranges of Neanderthal, Denisovan, erectus are estimates only. So it just goes over here and gives us some understanding. This just goes over some interesting information we had talked about before. When we would talk about that some of those L lineages, even like L6, it's important to know L1 to L6 are one, but L0 is a little different. But L1 to L6, they're one. As you can see, L6 actually is in Arabia. So L6 actually splits and actually settles in Arabia. And L3 actually starts over here in these areas. And actually, we found some that migrated over here, these areas. So that's important to know about these movements, just to get a more clear picture there. That's just a little summary of that. So real fast, the team of this one from 2006 and 2008 analyzed some mitochondria of 37 bones and teeth from 17 archaeological sites located around pretty much this certain area in Spain. And this is what they found. Most of the results were inconclusive, though. Out of 12 mtDNA sequences from the Chalcolithic period, right, that were received, 4 were reported as haplogroup L3. So they let you know that even L3 got to Spain. L3 was in Spain. He goes over, this brother goes over that. Let me just point it out where he points it out. So right here, you can see where they goes over these studies. So obviously, you know, if you ever have seen his little site, he cites his sources, right? His sources are cited. So you can go over these things and he'll talk about the ancient human remains in Eastern Spain. And he'll show you that there's 2 studies that verify L3 was found a long time ago in Spain. So by the biblical narrative is no problem of this line being also a Eurasian line, but also a line that's going to be private to a group that pops up in the said biblical time frame that's going to mix with certain groups. So that's very important, just to give a good understanding of that L line. So, and then they are obviously where they're coming from. They're coming from the cauldron pottery culture. So that L line is coming from that cauldron pottery culture. As we know, there's E1b1b there, right? In this cauldron pottery culture, which we had talked about sometime in the past, right? Talked about that as this line again, starting from here, going outwards, settling in those upper areas. It's very, very important. Get some other mtDNAs that's going to be around there, but you're going to also have other ones that's going to, and notice these areas. The reason why this is important because these areas we're going to look at, we're going to start around Mesopotamia, and then we're going to show you where the Jews and the Israelites, where those lines come from in Eurasia. But I'm going to say this last source, and then we're going to get into some things, get into Mota and some things. Remember, we talk about some areas of Africa. I'm going to read this last one real fast, and I'm going to give it to Will. Sorry, I've been going so long, Brother Will.
Oh, no, you good, brother.
And it's good, too, to have him here to verify these things as well, because I think these things need to be second verified. But let me grab a charger because I'm pretty sure, well, I got 9%. That's all right. I'll grab one in a little bit. All right, so let me point out something with this one. By comparing berries, I probably said it wrong, beresis, or berries, something like that, DNA to the ancient Europeans and modern populations, the researchers were able to demonstrate that the Eurasians who migrated to Africa descended from populations of what? Earlier Neolithic farmers that colonized Europe 7,000 years ago. And they were able to show that the Eurasian migrations into Africa left a larger genetic signature and reached a broader geographic area than previously thought. So we're gonna get into that real fast. Let me just close this note real fast. I'll reopen it because I did not mean to pop it up on another server, right? So this is the season of truth. Now it's time for the season of truth. It's time. It's time for the truth to come out and for people to, get out of Africa concept and thinking that a culture in Africa, it was just one certain culture and it's the culture that people claim that it is. Is we're given a clearer picture for all these things, right? It's going to be the real truth to the origins of modern culture, that it matches the biblical narrative more than it matches any other style of creation. So very important. So these areas are going to be kind of important. We'll look at that as we go over these things. But brother, we're gonna start. The first thing we're gonna point out is some things with Mota. Do you have anything real fast you wanna point out with Mota? Even if you want to do it on his note or anything like that, because he already seen this note.
Let's see. Yes, I can pull something out on Motor, but you get started and I will cut you off once I have it. So go ahead.
All right. As soon as
And
you do
then I
that,
will bring it out.
all right. As soon as you do that, I'm gonna look for my charger. I'm gonna give it to you when you do that. So this is gonna be very important. So here's an interesting study. I was gonna be talking about studies from 2020 and whatnot. We found the most present day Middle Easterns. We found that most present day Middle Easterns can be modeled as deriving their ancestry from four ancient populations. Who are those ancient populations? Levant Neolithic, Neolithic Iranians,
All right, family. So I believe the brother's laptop went dead. So since he was reading off that, I'll go ahead and continue the conversation from that. We're dealing with Moto right now. So in regards to Moto, people seem to fail to realize that Moto's DNA makes up a pretty good percentage of the Middle East today. And we can go to this source right here to look at that. So I'm sharing my screen. He got to share my screen. Yeah, family. So just wait. He got to share my screen. He got to get back and share my screen. Yeah, he got to get back and share my screen. So, anybody in the comment section have any questions, comments, anything they want to get off their chest or ask as of now while we're waiting for the brother to come back up? Is there any questions or anything in the comment section that you all would like to have answered before the brother comes back up? Because when he gets back, we're going to get back into this paper showing the four different groups the Levant is made up with, and Motorman being one of those, which is very, very interesting. And even in that paper, it goes on to say that the Levant is made up, Arabia is made up of both the Levant and Arabia as well. It's made up of African ancestry that they quote as some type of Bantu related ancestry, which we know would be E1b1. So you back?
Yep.
All right, he's back. All right, so y'all go ahead and share my screen. You wanted me to indulge into Motor real quick?
Yeah, let's indulge into that.
Okay, so I'm gonna actually start back from reading from the paper you was reading from. The genomic history of the Middle East. It states right here. When doing analysis on the Middle East, they did principal component analysis, and it showed that present-day Middle Easterners are positioned between ancient Levantine hunter-gatherers, such as the Natufians, Neolithic Levantines, who would also have haplogroup E, Bronze Age Europeans, and ancient Iranians. Well, actually, let me skip up some so we can deal specifically with Mota. Right here, it says, we found that most present-day Middle Easterners can be modeled as deriving their ancestry from four ancient populations: Levant Neolithic, Neolithic Iranians, as well as Eastern hunter-gatherers, and a 4,500-year-old East African Mota. All right, we observe a contrast between the Levant and Arabia. So something interesting to point out is that the Levant is made up of 4,500-year-old Mota DNA. And on the next slide, I'll show you all what specifically that Mota was, unless the brother wants to get into that and show you the Mota genome and how it will relate to that Middle Eastern population. And something else interesting to take out of this is that right here it says that our results here show this ancestry is much higher in the Levant compared to Arabia. Another contrast between the Levant and Arabia is the excess of African ancestry in Arabian populations. We found that the closest source of African ancestry for most populations in our data set is Bantu speakers from Kenya, which is interesting. And it even says we estimate that African admixture in the Middle East occurred within the last 2,000 years, with most populations showing signals of admixture around 500 to 1,000 years.
So that's important. Now, why is that genetically important? That Mota shows that it had connection, or these lines of Bantu shows that they have connection to the Levant 2,000 years ago. What happened 2,000 years ago that would disperse these lines into the lands of Africa?
Exactly.
70 AD, different things like that. We're gonna get into it.
Exactly. So when looking at the Mota genome, it gets real interesting because even if we go back to the Natufians, it says that they are autosomally omotic, which will go back to this person right here, Mota Man. And we'll read here from later Stone Age human hair from Vascan Shelter Cape Floristic regions of South Africa reveals genetic affinity to Khoi groups. And even right here, it says the Eastern African individual from Mota who lived about 4,500 years ago, excavated from the foraging context, also carried an E1b1 haplotype. So he carried an E1b1 haplotype, which makes sense because the Natufians carried E1b1 haplotypes as well.
That's right.
And right here it says it again. Mota was assigned to haplogroup E1b1. We verified this haplogroup by looking at mutations in Mota that were described in the International Society of Genetic Genealogy as defining the branch leading to haplogroup E1b1, which is very, very interesting.
That's right. That's right. And that is a great reason why we need to understand this Mota line and where's it going. And we also have talked about this, that a geneticist confirmed to us that Mota is not really African. And now we got to have a conversation about that today. And we're going to talk about who are the Israelites. We're going to go over the evidence of who are these Israelites. So it's going to be a deep sources today, very, very deep source. So now let me just have this little thing on my screen real fast so I know where to put a timestamp. Now we're going to dive into the Bronze Age. Now we're about to dive into the Bronze Age. So let's begin. All right. So first thing.
Go ahead. Never mind. Go ahead.
No, you're right. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say, once you get done, I want to show the people who were in Israel during the Bronze Age before the Exodus.
That's gonna be very nice to see. We're gonna have to see that. We're gonna definitely have to see that. Unless you want to show them right now, because I gotta reopen this note real fast.
Okay, if it's not okay, I guess I can real quick.
Unless you think it'd be better to save it at the end, because we'll hit that too. We're gonna go to.
Yeah, you go ahead. Yeah, you go ahead.
All right. So as the note opens, I'm gonna let it open up, and then we're going to dive into what is information of Bronze Age transitioning into the Iron Age of these Semitic families. All right, let this open up, and let's get back to where we was at. So, like he was just talking about with the Mota. Now, Mota also has a L3. That's why we was talking about L3 earlier. But let's talk a little bit more on some of those things, Mota. So we just talk about some things from that thing he was just talking about, right? We were just reading about this, about the Mota and everything. How we also know that as it says, Middle Easterns can be modeled as all these things, and 45,000 year ago, or that's actually 2000 BC, so 2500 BC, which Mota is actually E1b1. Which actually makes the V38 of your E1b1Cs and stuff like that, or other things like that. But this is going to be your Mota. He's going to be E1b1 P2, which actually links to the Natufian. That's why we talked about before that the Natufian information said that they made the Omic people. There's also links to that. But notice that those can be linked as Middle Eastern, because if you look at the E1b1C branch, is actually Arabian. It says we observed a contrast between Levant and Arabian. Levantans have access. It just talks about certain genes and everything or not. And it said right here, show previously had arrived in the Levant before the Bronze Age, along with people carrying ancient Southeast European Anatolia ancestry and everything. And it just goes over some different things. Our results here show this ancestry is much higher in the Levant compared to Arabia. Another contrast between the Levant and Arabia is the access of African ancestry in Arabian population. So we're going to get a good understanding on what is that said access of Arabian population. So obviously 2020. Let's get to another one. Using Malta's DNA, researchers have presented a theory that people from the Near East, now the Middle East, they say, began moving into Africa about 3,000 years ago. 3,000 years ago, they say. Malta, who predates the supposed migration by 3,000 years, they say, has no trace of European or Asian DNA in its genome. Now, why is that important? Because we also can note something important with this, that this is actually going to come from, see where this is coming from. They say this is not there. I threw this in there so we can talk about it. From times. So we got to note what's going to be from news and what's going to be from the direct information from the universities and things like that. So this is going to be very important. But this one was an older one. We got the update. So what I just showed you in 2021 is the update that yes, Malta is actually Middle Eastern. So this one was saying no, as some was saying no, but
and not to cut you off, brother.
We know that,
but you can you hear me? Mm-hmm. Yes, you will have to concede that is. You will have to concede that it's Middle Eastern, just from the fact that we have a branch, the same exact branch in the Levant, thousands of years before Malta.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And this is going to give us some major keys when we look at what's called the PCA. So this is called principal component analysis. So it analyzes, like we've seen with those mtDNAs, telling us how we can tell, because they want to say, oh, because it's E, it must not be Asian or European because it's E. And they'll say, oh, E, just say that's African. But we know the fossils say otherwise. So which could indicate that it says people. Now, what's interesting is this, that they say this, which could indicate that people from other parts of the world had not entered his region of Africa at the time he was alive. However, researchers say they will have to uncover more DNA from ancient Africans to further test the argument. So we got some papers. If you've seen, we had some papers that went over the fact that these Bantu groups, these E groups, are not actually African and that they actually migrated there. So you see that 3,000, we're going to get back to that in a little bit. So again, a little more on that E1b1, right? So E1b1 has a closely related family. Let's look at some fossils to get some understanding on some things. So E has linked to Akkadians as well. There's a lot of people that actually go over that talk about these things. It's a Semitics paper from a scholar. So empires and sources, Central Anatolian, how you say that? I keep saying this word.
Abyssinian,
that's how you say it. At Urkesh, right? Assyria during the Akkadian period. So during the Akkadian period. So it's just going to tell us a couple of different things I'm going to point out. So it just talks about some artifacts that they found at Urkesh, right, and everything. And they found obviously some people that had some connections and everything and whatnot. They found some very interesting connections and whatnot. So they already know that the king of Urkesh had made some marriage alliances with some people all around and whatnot. I'm just going to point out what they found that land, because I went over this paper before, but here's in some of those places around the land and what they find. They found that E1b1b, a Semitic group, was settled around the Levant in lands of Syria and was mixing with some of the women's around the area. So they got with N1, X2, J1 females, but they are going to be all E1b1b groups, but from E1b1 family. So E1b1's family. So very important to understand that this is going to be a Semitic family that's in that land. That's going to be also Semitic. So very important. So evidence of E1b1b shows E1b1a family ties, right? So other sons of Abram around Syria and Damascus, right? Just like we see Genesis 25:6. And notice this is going to be about Abraham's time frame. You can see those time frames. So 14 BC, 13 BC, stuff like that. So Abraham brought these children there. It's going to be some of their descendants. So very important. And it says, but unto the sons of the concubines which Abram had, Abram gave gifts and sent them away from Isaac his son, while he yet lived eastward into the east country. So that's into Arabia. So they're going to areas settled into Arabia. And also we know that we have broken it down. They went to areas of Syria as well. So it's going to be very important to get a little understanding of this time frame when Abraham would have had walked into the area and been in the areas of the Near East to make sure we can find some of their families around there to get a good understanding of that. So remember, we also had seen some information talk about some of these lines that went to Mesopotamia. Here we can see right here, if we talk about earlier people than Abraham, we would note that Abraham would come from Shemites. So he should have connections to Joktanites or some of the sons of Peleg, earlier sons from Eber. So according to ancient DNA analysis conducted in this one in 2020, on 10 remains from this little area here, pretty much a kingdom that was in the lands of the inhabitants of the kingdom of Ebla, were a mixture of Levantins, Iranians, and Anatolians. One early Bronze Age, so it says a little at this time a little earlier. So this is about Mota's time. So about Mota's time, individual carried haplogroup E1b1b, a lineage closely linked to the diffusion of Afro-Asiatic. That's important because Semitic comes from Afro-Asiatic. What's interesting is Joshua mentions that these lines that we see here are actually going to be on where? On the other side of Euphrates. As it says, Levantins, Anatolians, and Iranians. So it has some lines that's on the other side of Euphrates, as we can see in the scriptures. And I took your father Abram from the other side of the flood and led him through all the land of Canaan and multiplied his seed and gave him Isaac. Very important to understand that Abraham had other women as well, not just Sarah. He had Keturah, and he had Sarah's maid, right? Hagar. This individual is similar in ancestry component to approximately contemporary. I notice that again in the areas of Iberia, Iberian individuals and whatnot, and say in this certain time frame, a little bit right before Abram. So these will be early sons of Joktan, Eber, right, split into different areas, who had also had North African related ancestry, as well as the same mitochondrial DNA haplogroups, M1. There we talked about M1 and Y. So they all had M1, and they also had Y chromosome E1b1b, which are both typical, they say, of North Africans, they say, right? It says, following the African to Europe gene flow in both individuals show that such movements were widespread across the Mediterranean long before the classical period, when gene flows became intensive and the ancestors made a larger demographic impact. So it's letting you know that as these nations were small, they were moving across lands with each other, right? So these groups were moving together, and they were highly connected and everything, and they would have some early connections when they move about together and whatnot. So that's something that's important to know. So this just goes over some of that information. What we were just going over. Remember this little area here, right? That's why I was pointing out this up here, because we were talking about this culture right here, going over here and settling some of these areas, right? Coming from the Levant and settling some of those areas. So it's going to be very kind of important because we're going to see some connections with these things. That's going to be kind of on point with those things. So they're going to be settling in these little areas that we just seen right here. So it could be settling in these areas that we just seen. So let's talk about them in these little islands, right? So get a little more into it and what it's talking about here, right? Defining, we just went over that part. We're going to skip a little down, just talks about their genetic connections and everything. So We got into a little bit of it, right? The spread of steppe and Iranian related ancestry in the islands of Western Mediterranean. So you see what we're talking about there? We're talking about these lines being areas of that area, Mediterranean, at the time of Mota, right? So very important. We can also get a good understanding where also was E1b1a, who would also be in the Mediterranean. Let's take a look here. About that same time, in the Mediterranean, going in these areas, that was a line that settled up here, and it's this line right here. This is an E1b1a line. As we can see on Snip Tracker, it will come from the lines of M2, as we just spoke about it. You can see right here, coming from M2, this family right here. So it actually was up here in this area. So they're going to be settling up there. That's giving us understanding of other sons of Peleg, right? After the split and the diversing of these lines. That would be about 2000 BC at the same time with the movement of E1b1b in those areas. In fact, we're going to talk about how they also mention in those areas that they know that that's what was happening. Let me make sure I point out this source right here. Just got to make sure I also show these sources. So this is just Levantan Kingdom, Late Bronze Age. It just goes a little bit into some of the cultures and everything. This is the one I was pointing out of pretty much that E1b that was found in one of those cultures of Syria. Let's close that. All right, so interesting. That's very interesting, right? Giving us an E1b1a. I think, the years may be exaggerated, but I think that it might be maybe more like 14 BC.
What year was that?
That was 2500 BC. For that fossil that we just showed, for this one right here, this one would be, if you take 2000 off of that, that's 2000, almost 2500. That's 2400 BC in France.
Oh yeah, okay, I know about that. That was supposed to do and even if you go to that paper, it tells you they did a pan-Mediterranean expansion.
In fact, that's what we're gonna get into right now, because we're gonna get into the papers of it, because we're gonna get right into it. A little more into the depth of it, right? Watch what it says right here on some things, right? I'm just gonna give a quick understanding of something. So obviously that was found said 2400 BC. Yeah, I'm thinking more 14 BC, right? As a son of Eber, possible Israelite, Judah, right? Very important to know, right? A lot of books that go over these things. I'm just gonna skip this little read for now and point out something right here. And I need to go to this little thing right here because I want to show you what's going on there. So ancient genomes from present day, this is what we were just pointing out. Remember we was talking about this when we was talking about Mota? Let me just show you real fast when we was talking about Mota real fast. Maybe we was talking about Mota. Okay. 1 second. Let me relocate because we got a little munchkins coming this way. But let me point something out in a second. All right. Let's do the relocate real fast.
All praises, deep information coming.
Deep information. Raising little ones and raising a nation. Let's do it. Let's raise them to the truth. All right. Let me restore that. All right. Make sure I close this door so we get a concentration. All right. So let's understand what's going on here. So remember we was talking about that Mota. Let me just point that out real fast. Why was I pointing out Mota? Because on that Mota sheet, what it was saying was this. On that Mota sheet, this is what it was saying about the Mota sheet. It said that it had connections to someone who was in Europe 7,000 years ago. Remember that paper we was looking at right here? This is talking about that Mota. Just to point it out. Right? See right here? Talk about Mota. And it was saying that he had connections with someone that was said right here 7,000 years ago in Europe. So we're gonna look at that. What was Mota connected to 7,000 years ago in Europe? Right? While they're saying it has no connections to Eurasian. Here it is. So ancient genomes from a present day France unrevealed 7,000 years of demographic history. And if we go and take a look here, I got to open up a a source on here. That's why I say this little thing right here, so I could jump right to exactly where is that on this note. I'm gonna show you real fast what's going on here. Some brothers have touched on this as well. Let's see if it's on this one somewhere. Think about where is that. In fact, I don't need to do that. I could just click right here. I'm pretty sure I can find it on this thing. If not, I'll point it out. Let me
Correct me if I'm wrong, but are you making talking about the reference to Mota being close to that E marker we were just talking about, the EM2?
Yeah,
At first?
it's basically saying that they're family, that they would have like some family ties.
Exactly.
Just like it has ties to E1b1b, it has all E1b1a ties from, just like we see with E1b1. But it's showing us Mota came from this culture that I'm going to show you on this thing right here. See, where is that on here? Here it is. Just point it out just to show you this one. So obviously these are normal lineages to find up there, some European lineages, but we got an interesting one on this list. Let me see. I must have went right by it. I think I always overlook it somewhere. Got to think to myself if I'm looking at it right. Let me see. I must be overlooking my eyes. All right, so right here, there it is right there. Remember that find we were just talking about? There's E1b1a. It says 7,000 years ago, right? And you can see obviously it's giving us Neolithic. Remember I said E pops up in the Neolithic time frame. There's no Mesolithic nor Paleolithic find of E1b1a, only Neolithic. So we found one with E1b1b up there in the lands of Europe, as we see those lines moving about in those upper areas. In fact, now that we see that, as we know, even like we had to point out earlier, ancient E's up there and whatnot, we think about fossils. But let me point out real fast, as we see on this little thing, that we're pointing out that these lines were up there in Europe for a long time to give us some good understanding on these finds and everything. And let's point out something here. So a few E1b1 V38. So that E1b1 mutated to V38, which makes both M2 and E1b1c. So E1b1a and E1b1c comes from V38. So as it says, a few E1b1a V38 chromosomes are also observed in the same regions as V13. So you can see right here, what we see in here, that we see a prehistoric migrations through the Mediterranean basin shape the those little island areas that we was talking about with the Y chromosome. So we can see what's going on when we was talking about these little islands here. I was pointing out these little islands, right? Remember I was pointing that out right here when these little groups leave here and they settle on these little islands right here, right? They're leaving here and they're going those little islands and everything. So it's going to be very important to note a little bit. So that they're settling here. That means that they actually are going to be Mediterranean, right? So it's going to let us know that this line is actually Mediterranean. So very, very important. Let that do what it's doing there. I'm just close that. I don't know what just happened there. But that's important. That lets us know that, again, as we see, just to show you that that was on here. Just to show you that that is right here. Right? So we see right here, what did they find? They found some V38s there. So they found V38s, as they say. A few E1b1a V38 chromosomes are also observed in the same region as V13. How long ago? Expansion 7,000 years ago from the Balkans.
Exactly. And it says pan Mediterranean expansion, meaning they would have been expanding from those northern regions, either the Levant or the North African, more Mediterranean area.
That's right. And if someone thinks that's a long time ago, the T group, as we know, is actually older than the E1b1A group. So that's important that the E1b1A group is actually going to be younger than the T group. That the T group actually is going to be older, even older in Africa than the E1b1A group. And we had showed that when we had shown that same paper when we went over the lines of Japheth, and we showed T was earlier in the lands of Africa. Let's look at another letter piece. Why is that important? Because again, just because it's found in Africa doesn't mean it roots only to Africa, right? If T can be said Jews, why couldn't T? Why couldn't E? Right? Because it has more credence of being Jews, of being in the Levant, in the lands of pretty much, as you will see, the Natufian and other groups that be settled in that area. But these would be sons of those Shemites. Let's get a good understanding. Again, this person recognized it too. 7,000 years ago, a few E1b1A V38 chromosomes are also observed in the same region of V13. So you see why I was saying Mota have relations to the north? Actually does have relations to the north. Here's a full picture of that real fast. To get a full picture of it. And I need to open up one more note here just to show that. Here's a full picture of E's up here. Remember how we had shown that E's are younger, right? We don't have no 30,000, 40,000, 50,000 year old E's. E's are younger. They pop up in his land and they take the land from somewhere else, from someone else. And then they settle in these lands. But you can see right here, this is where they would have settled and around these little areas. And also over here, here's that E1b1A, E1b1A, and it's over here in this land. So you can see up in the lands of France. So it's a real confirmed find that if we look, is this age older than this age, than the Mota? There's a mutation. That's what Mota mutated to E1b1C or E-M329, but it was an E1b1, right? But notice it's younger than the one that we found up here. And notice something also interesting that I need to point out. Let me actually point this out real fast that I think is kind of important to match with this understanding. Let me actually grab this note here from D and point this out. Remember how we was pointing out Mota and that one in Eurasia and everything, and we were showing that Mota wasn't that old. And I'm also going to show you what a geneticist says about that Mota. That the geneticist that also looked in those lands concluded that Mota was not African because he actually looked into those lands. And he knows that Mota is not actually African based upon it being older in Eurasia. But let me show you something real fast. I think it's kind of interesting. Let's look in this land of Africa over here and notice something really interesting in this culture over here. Look at that T group. And we can note something with this T group over here that is going to have some close connections to these lands. And notice that's not years before present. That's BC. That means throw 2000 on that. That's 5,000 years ago. That means if this T was in Africa 5,000 years ago, that means that this right here will be matching with that T. So this right here will be matching with a T that would be in Africa at that same time, which will be older than Mota. That's years before present. That means that's only 2,500 years ago, right? So that's only 2,500 years ago. But this T that's in Africa over here, BC time, you can look at the paper. We can go to the paper real fast. That these are real genetic papers, right? Neolithics of the North Africa involved the migration of people from both the Levant and Europe. So if T has migrations and it's in Africa earlier than E1b1A, so T is in Africa earlier than E1b1A, and they say that it has connections to the Levant. So if we know that Mota ends up stretching from all the way from a line that was over here, going over here, didn't it have to go through the Levant to get there? Even if it went through here, it had to go through Eurasia to get here. Whether it went this way, whether it went this way, whether it went this way, it would have to cross the the Mediterranean in order to get into Africa. Just like T, if T is considered, because we know it has more earlier ties to Gasulians, but E1 lineages have ties to Natufians. And so that's important to understand, that if E is also going to be considered African, T should be considered African, R could be considered African. Almost every group that's found in Africa should be considered African, because they're not basing it based upon origin. They're basing it upon the amount that's there. So that's important to understand. If I have a cup that's clear, right, and I tell you to count 5 minutes, and at the last second I drop a red drop in the cup, and it fills the whole cup, and I tell you that red cup was there, that red in that cup was there in the beginning, you will say I'm a madman. But why is the same thing happening with E1b1a? When E1b1a drops itself somehow, some way, after being left from these areas and goes into Africa and increases there within modern times, why are we considering E1b1a rooted in Africa as the same way of a clear cup getting a drop in it at the end of its lifetime? So that's what I'm saying here. So one more time, I want you to understand what I'm saying here. This is a T found in Africa over this area in 5,000 years ago, 5,700 years ago, right? 5,700, 600 years ago. That's a 3,000 BC culture, 3,000 BC culture. But notice, no older E1b1a is older than this Mota. No older E1b1a is older than his Mota. Not only that, let me show you what a geneticist who worked on some of the papers in those islands of Mediterranean islands. Let me show you what he says about Mota, what he personally said about Mota. Peter Revesz, this is what he said after I asked him about that Mota. Is it true that Mota is only this old, right? 45,000 years back, so only 2000 BC, right? Making it only Bronze Age, pretty much. Because I was pointing out that we know that E1b1 is actually in the Natufian and all those things, the BMAC culture, right? We didn't even point out the BMAC culture yet, but he said, this is what Peter Revesz says, right? Just to let you know real fast on who this is. Maybe I should type his name down. Let's see. I forgot how you last that word.
It's always important to, reach out to these geneticists anytime you have questions or concerns, because a lot of times they'll reach back out.
That's right, and that's why you wanna have a conversation with these geneticists. I think I typed his name wrong. I put a Z on the spot where it was supposed to be a V. There we go. Let's see now. Bez, all right. Here's who I'm talking to. Pretty much. So Peter Revesz, right? He goes into the genetics. We talked about him before with the things he go into, a couple different things, right? He is going to be obviously giving his opinion. Let me read you what he says about Mota. You're right. That is not truly African. You're right. That is not truly African. So let's get that understood real fast, that Mota is not truly African. Also the BMAC culture, right? We can type down. All right, I'm just going to type it down real fast. We already went over this paper, right? We already talked about this culture here that we had talked about before. Right here, just to kind of show that. What do they have in this culture? They have E1b1a. They found an E1b1a culture 2018 in the lands of the BMAC culture. So that's important to know right about here. That means that this group would have had a connection from here to here. What does that kind of remind you of? If this area was covered with a culture, what culture would be most likely the culture that would blend these kind of areas together, especially the control of the Levant? The Akkadian culture and of the rise of the later, some of the Semitic cultures, and then until the replacements of them in the lands of the Levant. So very important. So this culture is actually going to have connection to Semitic cultures. So Semitic cultures, and it is going to be, as we said on this paper, right? What was I saying earlier? I'm going to read it one more time, right? R1b in Africa before E1b1b, and T is in Africa before E1b1a. So a T1 haplogroup was found in Africa, Morocco Neolithic time before any Bronze Age E1b1a are found in Africa from E1b1p2 of the Natufians. And R1b was replaced in Africa by E1b1b only after the 14,000 time frame, by basically by the scientific scale, right? Remember that scales 100,000 years or more, pretty much. But E is as young as RT, because we had talked about these things that we talked about, how R and T was in Africa earlier than E. So is E African? If E is African, T and R has to be African. E is not African. E is Eurasian. It's a Shemite. In fact, we got some historical movements that happens in time that we know. About 18 BC, according to Arab historians, Joktanite tribes entered and conquered South Arabia, but were largely absorbed by the Kushite stock. What does that mean? I mean, the Joktanites were mixing with the females, and the females were basically making them a little darker. So the Joktanites were mixing with different females. This is important because we're getting to Bronze Age, Iron Age transition, where we're going to start seeing certain MT lines with these E groups. Notice these E groups got some different mtDNA lines, but then when the time of Abraham comes, right, he gets with certain female lines that he calls his sisters, things like that. Well, these are important because it's going to get with certain mtDNA lines that we're going to note that goes with certain cultures. But it says, as a result of which the second or Sabaean empire of Ad was formed, in which the Joktanites became the sacred and land-owning castle. See, they wasn't, when they say they was absorbed by the Kushite stock, that means they got in more of the women of the Kushite, but the Joktanites were the land-owning caste, so it's important. While the political and economic activities were that dealt with the Egyptians under the said, what's that, the 13th dynasty. So notice that. Why is that important? The 13th dynasty, that's the rise of Abraham. Well, 12th dynasty, my bad. Right before the rise of Abraham. Joktanites were in Africa right before the rise of Abraham. So as pictured at this place, concerning which the publication of the Egyptian exploration funds seemed too little and whatnot. Just go over some things, but it just finished up like this. Just talks about Joktanite stock in Yemen. What happened with the Joktanite stock in Yemen? Migrated into Africa, establishing themselves in Abyssinia, right? That's ancient Ethiopia. Continued the ancient conflict for 6 centuries more. So that means that Joktanites were at least in the lands of Africa for centuries. That we would have some of the Shemites moving into the lands of Africa. So that's very important. So that's going to be a read from this little source right here. I'm going to get a little more into it. And we know that was happening early because we know Sabaeans, that's the formation of the Sabaeans. We know Sabaeans were fighting against people like Job and stuff like that. So Job was definitely in the BC time. So that means Shemites were in Africa by BC time. So very, very important. And we know that E3A, which is E1b1a, actually has presence in Oman, 7%, Yemen, 3%, United Arab Emirates, so Arabia, 5%, Qatar, in the corner of Arabia, 2%, right? And it just lets us know that a lot of them also have moved around during some of the slave trades. But we know that these movements were a little earlier, and that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to point out that some of these early movements, but this is letting us know that these E lines are also in these little areas, right? When we talked about where it came from the Neolithic, right? Talk about where it actually came from, right? Its origins and everything. All right, so a little more in the sub-Saharan African male-specific contribution represented primarily haplogroup E-M2, right? Occurred at only 9% in pretty much these little populations, but 9% is still a percentage. Why is this important? Because it's going to let us know that M2 got up over here, right? to kind of make it clear. Right here is in India, right there. So it's let us know that about some M2s that's gonna get over here in these areas, right? That's gonna be kind of important because what we're gonna connect is we're gonna show that the Jews had left from areas after the Babylonians attacked them, after Nebuchadnezzar had attacked them. That's going to be about the 500s BCs. But it says, just talking about the haplogroup, it's saying that it's in that area using information. Just says, obviously, it got some of those connections there. And obviously, their mtDNA is there as well. It just talks about some things. And it says this: these findings must be interpreted in the light of known historical data. Forced migrations from Africa began in the 7th century AD and increased considerably during this certain dynasty, the ones in Oman. Now, why is this important when it says migrations from Africa? It wasn't really from Africa, it was from Arabia. Why is that important? We'll talk about that another time. This is actually talk about the cities and the connection to them going, as again, you can see some things right there. Looking at again, we talk about some things of the Fertile Crescent of that time and everything, and notably in Elam and stuff like that. So some connections with Elam, the Elamite civilization with it, and Davidians and stuff like that. Why? Because the language goes back and a couple of different things go back. But what is it talking about? Long story short, it's talking about some things like the cities and things like that, pretty much. Just to kind of make it clear on some things. But let me go back over here so we can get a little more deeper into it. So real fast, it's just a quick summary of something. Let's go a little more into it. Watch what it says here. Remember, Will actually just talked about this. Another contrast between the Levantine and Arabia is the access of African ancestry in Arabian populations. We found that the closest source of African ancestry for most populations in our database is Bantu speakers from Kenya. In addition to the contributions, so that just means like E1b1 groups. In addition to contributions from Nilo-Saharan speakers from Ethiopia, they say. Watch what they say here. We estimate that the African admixture in the Middle East occurred within the last 2,000 years, with most populations showing admixture between that 5,000 to 1,000 years ago. That's during that Islamic conquest between 5,000 and 1,000 years ago.
Now you know what's
mm-hmm.
Not to cut you off, but you know what's interesting about this statement? There's an Arab geneticist that made a comment on this similar situation, and he was basically bringing up the fact that Arabs have come back a lot of times with EM2, and when they do, they think they descend from African slaves, but when they go into a deep dive, they found out that they've had that haplogroup, and it's been there for at least 2,000-3,000 years in Arabia.
That's right.
And it has nothing to do with the slave trade. So just showing again that it's there.
That's right. That's right. This little part, I'll be back as I put a space right here. We'll build on this and we'll talk about some things with Arabia and the Islamic slave trade and the Jews. We'll get on some things on these little parts. But this is going to connect them to the areas of the pretty much the Middle East, or what you would say Arabia. And it also connects them to this culture. We'll come back to this a little later. But it talks about some Jews during the Islamic countries in Oman. So it was talking about some of the Jews also that had connections to China. We was talking about some of those things with some groups that had connection to China and Yemen. So this is just a little short little read and everything. But it just talks about how they had some Jews in Arabia and Oman and whatnot. Let's talk about how they was fighting. We'll go into some things on that. So this is a little highlight. But jumping down to some information. This one, I think, Will, you should read this one because this is your source. This one is deep, but I'll show you what was going on here. This one is basically, as you can see.
Yeah. So actually, I wanted if you want to wait for this, or
let's say this one. Let's say this one at the end.
Yeah,
so
because I want to show who was in the Levant first before we get to the. I want to show who was there before we get to the Jews coming in. You get what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. That's a good idea. All right, I'll skip down. As you can see, it's just these last little parts right here. All right, so I'm going to read these highlights here. Because there is archaeological, historical, and linguistic evidence for contact with non-African populations between about 3,000 years ago, it has often been assumed that the non-African ancestry in the HOA populations dates to about this time. But you see the information we went over. Watch what it says. It says the Somali IAC has the third broadest distribution and is found in all Cushitic and Semitic speaking populations, as well as Omic speaking, how you say that, Walata and Ari Capitalist. How you say that? So it's letting you know that they're gonna have some connection to some Eurasians by some of the admixtures. So it's going to let us know about some of the admixtures that they have there. Just point it out real fast on this thing. So it's just going over certain connections, certain origins of certain groups. But you can see early back to Africa migration into the Horn of Africa. So you see what's going on? Remember, we just talked about those certain groups from Yemen going into certain areas and everything. And then we talked about how it just said here, it's from that same source, how it talks about the pretty much the Omic speaking groups are going to be Cushitic and Semitic. So that has connections to out of Africa. It says Ethiopic, I probably said that weird, Ethiopic IAC reaches its highest frequencies in the Omic speaking Ari and Walata populations and is present at moderate frequencies in Semitic and Cushitic speaking populations. So you can see as it's going over these populations and everything and what's going on there. So it just says some things. I'm just going to skip down a little bit, but it just says some things about some things of some mixtures that they have in them and everything. I'm just going to skip a it says this IAC just says color red. I'm going to point out on some things and just talks about certain things of these groups and everything. I'm just pointing out what it is I'm talking about. It's just basically letting you know that even though the migration of the language, and we have spoke about this, it's showing that there were some movements between 3000 BC and 1080 of these groups, and they're going to have connections to areas actually outside of Africa, but movements going into the lands of Africa. So it's going to be very important. So 3000 BC, within that time, most have moved down there. So that's important. Until they'll say 1980s, I'm just going to skip a little down where it's just going to talk about some things where they're actually going to talk about some of the lines that actually moved into areas of Africa. It just says basically right here, Southern Arabia, mainly Sabaean. Maybe we'll talk about the Sabaeans, the Joktanites and the Sabaeans. It just says Southern Arabian, mainly Sabaean, colonized the northern horn of Africa in the early first millennium BC. Remember, we just point out that in the source, right? The historical source. There's a historical source that said about the second millennium BC and first BC, the Joktanites went down and became the Sabaeans. So that's going to be kind of important to know. They also mixed with some of the Cushites and their stock and everything, just to show that book where that's coming from. It's coming from this book right here. It's getting some deep sources on these things. But now the genetic sources are actually showing some connections as well. As it says right here, it says Sabaeans colonized the often northern horn of Africa in the early first millennium BC. According to this reconstruction, the South Arabian colonists dominated the local populations. After that was probably all mashed up. The kingdom of Sabi in Yemen in the 3rd and 4th century BC gave rise to basically one of the later kingdoms of Asham and stuff like that. And if you know Akum, something like that, Akum, probably said that weird. But it talks about this rise of this kingdom that rises up. So it's letting you know that those lands have ties to Shemites, right? It's letting you know that they're going to have ties to Shemites, and the genetic also shows connection to those things. So the Sabaeans in the mid 1st century has connections to these groups, as we had talked about the Omic groups and the Ari and the Cushite and Semitic speaking groups. They're going to all be fairly connected. You can see here's just like a summary of it. The development of ancient states in northern Horn of Africa. So 3000 BC to 81,000. So we just touching on that, on some of these things, as you can see here. Back migration, right? Touching on the same stuff, right? Very, very important. And then this last one, this shift was due to changes in the general pattern of inter-regional contact between regions, right, facing the Mediterranean Sea and Indian Ocean along the Nile Valley, Red Sea, and Western Arabia from the 4th millennium BC to 1st millennium BC. So it's saying we should at least see ties of all these cultures going into Arabia and Africa. So it's saying these areas here from the Indian Ocean, right here, from this Indian Ocean. Remember, I was pointing this out on another source when I was showing you that India and Ethiopia then had connections, and also areas of the Nile and Mediterranean had connections. This whole area was connected by the time Abraham got there. But mostly those lines were going into Africa. Notice the Sabaean and the Joktanites went into Africa. So we should at least find, especially in East Africa, where E1b1a lineages start popping up. They start popping up over here. But also, they don't start there. They start over here because they began around these areas. They began around these areas and these areas. And they start to diversify as they multiply. So they would start over here in the lands of Syria after coming off of the ark and going into some of these areas, and then they dwell in all these different areas. So you see how what I was saying, how they will go in Africa and out of Africa. So Africa doesn't separate them from the biblical narrative, right? It's just another landmass. That's all it is. So one more thing, the last thing I got for you, right? What's interesting is people that settled modern, some of the modern Jews. We're gonna get to this on the source that Will's gonna talk about. But what's interesting is this. This was interesting. I'm gonna read this one first. Pure Egyptian, right? Non-mixed, without foreign yDNA. Basically, before. Remember we talked about the 12th dynasty of Egypt. They know that pure Egyptians without mix in that land, the Egyptians that settled in that land, they would have been there about the 12th dynasty of Egypt. Let's say 4,000 years ago, right? 4,000 years ago, you would have some people in Egypt that wouldn't be mixed. What's interesting about that is that E1b1, Ramses E1b1a, Ramses the third, is not before this. Ramses the third line, because what's interesting, some people try to say E1b1 would be the Egyptians. But the funny thing about that is that we don't have that line in Egypt earlier than M13. That's important, that these lines are going to be a little more separate. But this is just something important to go over pretty much.
Not only that, and one thing people hate to bring out about Ramses is that he was autosomally Northeast African / West Asian.
That's right. That's right.
So
That's absolutely
yeah, you go ahead, brother. I believe the brother. Yeah,
Will,
you
you can
go.
go ahead. I think you had something you want to go over real fast.
Yeah, so you did a good job at laying down
Yes.
the foundation thus far about everything. So like you said, you wanted to touch on the Bronze / Iron Age Israelites. So what I wanted to do real quick before we got into the Israelites real quick is show what exact lineages we can find in Israel before or in the Levant area or in the areas we know the Israelites would have settled prior to the Exodus.
Okay. And while you pulling something out real fast, I want to answer this brother real fast.
Go
What
ahead.
test or what company does a great job at testing DNA? I used to think it was family tree DNA, but the best one I found was if you were going to do that, I would go to living DNA. Living DNA is going to give you a Y chromosome and an empty DNA, and you can see it right here. And I think it's not too shab. It's like $80. I guess for someone that wants to find themselves, that's probably price. It's probably priceless to find yourself, I guess. So that's how I would say. It'll give you your yDNA, your mtDNA on that, and also you can use those same yDNA, mtDNA for um, using it on like my true ancestry and stuff like that. You can use it for like other sites and whatnot. So I would say that would be the best source. And I hand it over to Will real fast.
Yeah, so can you see my screen, brother?
Yes, I can.
All right, so real quick before I try to show or show the foundation of EM2 in Israel or being an Israelite amongst the Israelite lineage, we're going to go to this source right here. Canaanites live. DNA reveals fate of biblical people. All right. It says some very interesting things within this article. For example, it says the people of modern day Lebanon can trace their genetic ancestry back to the Canaanites. New research finds. It says the Canaanites were residents of the Levant during the Bronze Age, all right, starting about 4,000 years ago. So this is the start of the Bronze Age. This would be right before the Israelites getting into Abraham and the Exodus, transitioning into that time. They're best known from the Old Testament of the Bible, in which they're described as the cursed descendants of Canaan, blighted by the God because Canaan's fathers dishonored his own father, the patriarch Noah. The Canaanites were often in conflict with the Israelite tribes that wrote the Hebrew Bible. In fact, the book of Deuteronomy features Yahweh or God ordering the Canaanites to be exterminated, in part because the Canaanites kept their records on easily degradable papyrus rather than clay. Little is known about their side of the story. But now ancient DNA reveals that the Canaanites were descendants of Stone Age settlers and the ancestors of the Lebanese. Right here it says the researchers then accompanied the genetic sequences of the ancient Canaanites with those of 99 modern Lebanese people, as well as with ancient DNA sequences of more than 300 other people from ancient DNA databases. So they actually exhumed Canaanite burials and compared them to modern day Lebanese people and 300 other people in this DNA database. What they found was that the Canaanites probably had coloration in skin, eyes, and hair as modern day Lebanese people do. And it goes on to say right here that the Canaanites themselves descended from Stone Age settlers who mixed with newcomers from what is now Iran around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, the researcher says. All right, so these people would have been coming from Iran 4 to 5,000 years ago, right before the Israelites. The DNA showed with a bit of Eastern hunter-gathering and Eurasian steppe influence that got added to the mix some 3,000 years ago, the researcher says. So let's continue on real quick and find out what haplogroups exactly those were. Continuity and admixture in the last 5 millennia of Levantine history from ancient Canaanite and present-day Lebanese genome sequences. It tells us that they found in these Canaanite sites of the Levant, specifically in Lebanese samples, and even in Sidon, right here which we know was a Canaanite site. It says, in addition, the two Sidon BA males carried the Y chromosome haplogroups JP58 or J1A2B and JM12 or J2B, both common male lineages in the Near East today. Haplogroup JP58 is frequent in the Arabian Peninsula with proposed origins in the Zagros Mountain region. And brother, if you want to hop in anytime, feel free. Okay.
No problem.
So this is also important as well because it's showing us that JP58 was actually in Canaanite burials. And this is actually dated to, where is that? Let me put this on. This is dated to 3,700 years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even with the J2, it's dated to 3,000. 650 years ago, and it's telling us these people's origins is in the Caucasus. All right, so we see that these people were already in the Levant. J groups, and I even forgot to mention the Natufians. We know the Natufians and their related ancestries would have been in Levant, so we know E1b1 and E1b1b lineages would have been already in the Levant as well. So keep that in mind. E1b1, E1b1b, JP58, J112 as well. Ancient DNA sheds lights on genetic origins of early Iron Age Philistines. So we're going to deal with another Canaanite population. During the 12th century, specifically, resemblances between the new cultural traits and the 13th century patterns found in the Aegean have led some scholars to explain the so-called Philistine phenomena by migration from Aegean-related sources, potentially associated with the Sea Peoples. A
And that's
population.
important.
Go ahead.
That's important. Where it says they're from the Aegean. That's from the Aegean. That's from up above Greece. Is letting you know. Because remember, at that time, Israel came where? Out of Africa. They came out of Africa. That's going to be a real out of Africa experience that Israel was pulled out of Africa and Egypt. But these are sea peoples coming from the Aegean, from the north, coming
Exactly.
downward.
Exactly. Great catch. Great catch. And
Mhm.
even if people was to say, well, it didn't get there till right around the Exodus, well, they was coming from the Aegean.
And not just that, they wouldn't get away with saying it got there around the Exodus because this is the sea people that Ramses the
Thank
second
you.
defeated.
Mm,
The ones that settled in the Philistine area, those were defeated by Ramses the third. But the ones by Ramses the second and Seti, that was sea peoples that was invading the lands of the Phoenician area before they start getting to Egypt. Because when it got to Egypt,
mhm.
like that inscription right there, that's a description most likely by Ramses the second,
It is.
and that's a description because Ramses the second, Ramses the third, Ramses the third defeated the Sea Peoples and settled them in the lands of the Philistine area. But we know that the Sea People were there, just like it says here, 17 BC earlier than that. So it was a long time.
Exactly. Exactly. And even right here it goes on to say, even for those who do accept the idea of a large scale mobility, that the homeland of the new arrivals, all right, the homeland of the new arrivals, is disputed with suggested alternatives, including Cyprus or Sicily, a mixture of non-Asian East Mediterranean peoples and mixed heterogeneous maritime groups akin to pirates. Proposed links go as far as northern Italy, where depopulation events have suggested to trigger population movements throughout the Mediterranean. Recent ancient DNA studies have reported a high degree of genetic continuity in the Levant during the late Paleocene and early Holocene that followed by increasing population admixtures with Anatolian and Iranian related populations at least up to the middle Bronze Age. All right, so again, we in this Bronze Age, we're seeing the integration of these peoples into Canaan. All right, showing what people was already there. Genome-wide data from late Bronze Age and Iron Age populations have so far not been available from this region. But we're going to show how we can. I'm gonna just get into it. 1 second. Again, that's a picture of them, and this is the haplogroups of these Sea peoples as well. So we see another J group associated with the Sea peoples. We have a R group associated R1 associated with the Sea peoples, and even an L associated with the Sea peoples. But when we get into this BT, I would like to think that this was original Canaanite, an original son of Canaan that was still left within that population by the time they took these samples.
That's right.
So with that, I'm gonna exit out of this. Then I'm about to go to this paper because again, we just saw in the Middle Bronze Age and in the Bronze Age period that there was an introgression of these lineages into the Levant, and we already know that the Natufian ancestry was already there.
That's right.
So we're gonna go to African gene flow or the history of African gene flow in Southern Europeans, Levantines, and Jews, real quick. And it's basically just talking about the gene flow in these different Middle Eastern groups that actually correlates with different events like the Exodus, the Assyrian captivity, Arab expansions, and even Sephardic Jews crossing over into Southern Europe.
Is this that paper? This that one?
Yes, sir.
All right. I want everybody to pay it. I want everybody to pay attention. I'm telling you right now, all the stuff that we just showed, it all comes down to this source right here. I want you to pay attention to the truth of what's being found in the world today that we're in.
Now, for this, I'm just going to focus on the quote unquote Jewish groups. I'm not going to focus on the Southern Europeans. I may go into the Levant. Well, I'm not going to focus on the Levantines either because that's not around the time frame we're focused on. But I will focus on the Jews because it points out something. And where should I start? So to start off, I just want to show that in this specific article, in this specific data test, they're using the Yoruba Nigerians to represent the sub-Saharan Africans that we will be talking about in this study. We know that the Yoruba genome is composed of 95% E1b1. So this is the lineage that we will be talking about in the Levant, or specifically in this Jewish group. So let's see. Let me go down. Let me find the exact spot, and then we're going to get into it. 1 second. So it starts here. It says here, a striking finding from our study is the consistent detection of 3 to 5 sub-Saharan African ancestry in the 8 diverse Jewish groups we studied. Ashkenazis from Northern Europe, Sephardi's from Italy, Turkey, and Greece, and Mizrahis from Syria, Iran, and Iraq. This pattern has not been detected in previous analysis of mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome data, although it can be seen when re-examining published results of structure-like analysis of autosomal data. It was not highlighted in those studies are shown to be unambiguously reflect sub-Saharan African admixture. So that's also interesting as well, because Marjani just said, although this has not been this pattern has not been detected in other, I guess you can say, published data sets, if you was to re-examine the information, you can definitely find it. All right, as it said. But it says here, we estimate that the average date of the mixture of 72 generations, which goes on to about 29 years per generation, assuming 2,000 years, assuming 29 years per generation, essentially. It is older than that in Southern Europeans and other Levantines. The point estimates over all 8 populations are between 1,000 and 3,400 years ago. Now, 3,400 years ago puts us right around the Exodus, if not during the time of Abraham. But I'm going to keep on to read before I even give my opinion. It says, but with the largely overlapping confidential intervals, it says it is intriguing that the Mizrahi and Iranian and Iraqi Jews, who are thought to descend at least in part from Jews who were exiled to Babylon about 2,600 years ago, share the signal of African admixture. An important caveat is that there is significant heterogeneity in the dates of African mixture in the various Jewish populations.
That's deep.
Facts. And even here it says a parsimonious explanation for these observations is that they reflect a history in which many of the Jewish groups descend from a common ancestral population, which itself was admixed with Africans prior to the beginning of the Jewish diaspora that occurred in the 8th to 6th century BCE. So this is letting us know that the Jews would have had quote unquote African or Yoruba or E1b1, right? Prior to the 8th to 6th century BCE, which we know is the Assyrian exiles. But here it says the point estimates over all 8 populations are between 1,600 to 3,400 years ago. So in some populations, it goes back to 3,400 years ago, which is interesting. So let's look at this real quick. For example, which one goes back the most generations? It would be the Iraqi Jews, right? So if we was to do 150 153 times, let's say, what did they say the average data generation was? 29 years. So to add up this admixture date real quick, let me bring up a calculator real quick. Try to make some sense of this. So let's do 153 times 29. Excuse me, 29. And it gives us 4,437 years
And
before
isn't
print
that and isn't that interesting? Because that's gonna take us right back to the origin, saying that these
of the
lines.
Israelite population. Go ahead,
Mhm.
brother. Go ahead. Go ahead.
And it's basically showing us that as it says, the said African admixture was there in the beginning of the Jewish people. That means there is no Jew without an African admixture. That's what they're saying. They're saying there is no Jew without that quote unquote African admixture. That means it's not the same mixture as the Canaanites. That means it's a little different. It's African
Exactly.
admixture. Mhm.
So by the time the Israelites would have popped back on the scene in the Levant, EM2, or this quote unquote sub-Saharan African Yoruba, would have been a new haplogroup on the scene. More than likely, if this, with this date going back 4,437 years before present, with this admixture date in these Iraqi Jews, that's letting us know that more than likely Jacob himself would have had this haplotype. And even if you look at these other Jewish populations, it's showing us when E1b1 actually formed the, I guess you can say, mixed with these populations in these communities. So say, for example, it said that the Iraqi Jews descend from Babylonian Jews. Okay, so say E1b1 got expelled up to Babylon, got expelled and went up to Babylon and start admixing with those populations and formed the Iraqi or Iranian Jewish community. This is where we start to see that admixture date take place. All right, even with Sephardic Jews. Let me calculate this real quick because we know what time period the Sephardic Jews were going into Spain. Get a calculator real quick. Does that make sense? What I'm saying, brother?
Yeah, and when you finish with that, I want to go over it that
Go ahead.
same way.
Okay,
What
let me
once
say this real
you do that.
quick. So, for example, we know the Sephardic Jews have been in Spain for over 2-3 thousand years. This African ab, or what this is showing basically, to make it make sense, this is showing Israelites with E1b1 going into these different communities and starting these new populations with these other groups and admixing with them. So it's showing E1b1 going up into this, I guess you can say, into Italy and starting the Ashkenazic Jewish community with this date of 91 generations ago or 76 generations ago. Same with the Syrian Jews, same with the Iranian Jews, but the Iraqi Jews seem to be those Jews that we would go back to from the own start. And even they are said to be some of the purest and ancientest Jews. So you go ahead, brother.
All right, so I want to go. So I want to just highlight. I want to highlight what the brother just was talking about. All right, so this is what he was talking about. I'm gonna read a highlight of what he was reading. This pattern has not been detected in previous analysis of mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome data. So they're saying when looking at Y chromosome and mtDNA, they're saying that supposedly they're saying this wasn't detected. And although it can be seen when re-examining, because that's how you do science, you got to re-examine the data, prove the data. That's how you know if it's true. You don't want someone just looking at the data and say this is what it is, but someone else test it and say, well, I think I found something else. That's why they said re-examining the published results of structure, like analysis of autosomal DNA. This is why PCA is important. Autosomal DNA can actually go far back in a PCA. They can test it all the way thousands of years back. It was not highlighted in those studies. Why is this important to highlight in those studies? Because this is what we've been saying for a long time, or shown, right, to reflect sub-Saharan African admixture. Remember how we kept saying how they kept saying E is sub-Saharan African, but notice that they're saying that and these ones they found sub-Saharan African. We estimate that the average date of the mixture of 79 generations, that's at least 2,000 years, assuming 29 years per generation, so 2,000 years back, is older than that in Southern European or other Levantines. So it's very important. That's letting you know that the said African mixture goes deep inside the Jews. And it says the point estimates over all 8 populations are between, they'll say, 1,600 to 3,400 years ago. If you do the math on that, take 2,000 off of 3,000. That's about the Israelite time frame. 14 BC is letting you know at least 14 BC till the scattering of them, as we're gonna see, of the scattering of the dispersal in the 6th century. So that's gonna lead us up to that time frame. So that's giving us the Israelite exile when they was in the lands of Egypt. So that's 14 BC when they was 400 years. They was growing. And they was about to leave out of Exodus soon, but with largely overlapping confident intervals. And it says it just goes on and talks about certain Jews, right? Mizraeli, Iranian, and Iraqian Jews who are thought to descend. So it's looking at these Jews who are thought to descend, at least in part, from Jews who were what? Who were exiled to Babylon about 2,600 years ago. So take 2,000 off of that. That's 6 BC, right? That's 6th century BC. So 2,000 off of that, that's 600 BC. So he let us know that going back.
Shalom, family. I think the brother cut out again. All right. So yes, this paper is very, very important because again, it's showing us that regardless of what people say, E1b1 or sub-Saharan African, as they like to call it, would have been a part of the original Israelite population. The Israelites would have been coming out of Egypt with E1b1. And we can even take it a step further. We see the Iraqi and Iranian Jews from Babylon having this DNA as well. And even if we take it further from there, we know that during the time of Nebuchadnezzar, Sephardic or Babylonian Jews were exiled to Spain to be captives for the king. And that's where you get the Sephardic Jews. And if we look in Spain and things like that during the Sephardic Moorish period, we indeed find E1b1 there as well. So it just brings more credence to when we go to places like West Africa and look at your Igbo, look at your Yoruba, look at your Balfours, and see this same haplogroup at an even more prevalence rate. We shouldn't be so resistant to thinking these people cannot be Israelites, especially when we see that their specific haplotype was amongst the original population. So yes, we're just gonna wait 1 second for the brother to come back. He can share his screen to get back going what he had going. But as of now, if anyone has any questions or anything, feel free to put them in the comment section, and I can answer them. All right. Oh, what they mean? So yes. All right, shalom, brother Shakur. How you doing? Shalom, New Hope Family Investments. How you doing? DQ, how you doing? Shalom to everyone in the chat. So hopefully the brother will be loading up here soon. Yes, hopefully he will be loading up here soon. Yeah, it's very interesting indeed. Even here recently, we had Sephardic Jews actually declare Igbos as authentic Israelites, and actual descendants of Israelites, by way of their Y chromosome. They even said that they share Y chromosomes with the Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews, and that they, conducted genetic analysis and found that their Y chromosome comes from the Levant. And what's that Y chromosome? E1b1a. So yeah, it's definitely a Levantine, Middle Eastern Jewish haplotype. And even when the brother get back, I can go to jewishdna.org and even show you E1b1a on there and give you the history about that, because they say that E1b1a was coming from Mesopotamia on jewishdna.org, which is interesting. So for people who like to say E1b1a can't be Israelite, they should re-examine that.
They gotta re-examine it. That's some deep truth. Did you get that last part?
Yes,
Must have bugged out.
right. Yes, you good?
Yep, you got that last part where I just read that, just this last thing where it says this may reflect the descent of these groups from a common ancestral population that already had some African ancestry prior to the Jewish dispersal.
So what that mean? These groups descend from a common ancestor who had E1b1a.
That's right. E1b1a are the Israelites, and that's gonna be the source of the truth. So if anyone has any disagreements or anything they want to put up, anything, you can put a comment in, or you can join the link there.
Let me share something real quick, brother. Once you get a chance to share my screen,
Your screen is shared.
I want to just share something real quick, because even if you was to go to jewishdna.net, it has something very interesting about E1b1a. So I believe it's right here. Let's go to E1b see if it's in here. Right. So we can go to, I believe these are EM2 clays as well, some of these others, but we're going to look at this P277 real quick. And it says two of the reported persons have the same surname. The third reference is from YSearch. It's not possible to find this. That on ysearch.org. The person is from Poland. This yDNA branch P77 is mainly from Eastern Africa. A few persons are from the Middle East, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait. The person probably went from Mesopotamia or Egypt to Ashkenazic countries, right? And even that paper would explain, that same admixture date for the founding of that Ashkenazic population. So even JewishDNA.org know that EM2 is, I guess you can say, Jewish or Israelite, and it's actually considered. This branch is a member of the Ashkenazic branches. So P277 is an Ashkenazic Jewish branch according to this site, which is funny. And here it gives us the age of the branch, showing it Eastern Europe, Germanic countries, Southern Europe, the Middle East, Britain, Ireland, and other countries, which is interesting. I'll show one more, then I'll give it to you, brother. Let's see. EM2C. No, it's not giving us nothing, but this is considered Sephardic Jewish.
That's a great question.
And this is the last. Well, you can go ahead. Yeah, this is all.
Okay,
This,
I just want to, because I went back to see what happened. I don't know why it didn't express what I wanted to express real fast. Let me just screen share and express this one more time, because I want to express this so that we end off on this note, to really express what that source that you just showed.
yes,
One more time on this source. All right. So this pattern, right? Like we said, it was. I'm just gonna summarize it. They were looking at the Y and the mtDNA, and previous studies were not showing that Jews had evidence of an ancient PCA of connection to those E1b1 groups and some of the said African groups. But they know, as they say, they looked at the studies and they did find those evidences in those groups that they did reflect a sub-Saharan African mixture, right? And in fact, they estimated that mixture to go at least back to 70 AD, and they also dated that mixture to at least go back to the time of the beginning of the Exodus, of the beginning of the Jews in the lands of Avaris and before the lands of before Exodus, to show that the Jews had a early mixture in them, African mixture in them, at least going back to the time of when they was before the Exodus, and at least to the time of 6th century BC. So that's going to be very important. And it just lets us know that they were looking at Maserati, Iranian and Iraqi Jews, who are thought to descend at least in part from Jews who were exiled to Babylon about 2,600 years ago. So that's about 500, 600 BC when Nebuchadnezzar was there. Shared, and he said that those Jews shared a signal of African admixture, right? So that's
So
very
they
interesting.
brought that from the Levant with them to Babylonia.
That's right. That's right. And it says an important caveat in that there is significant heterogeneity, pretty much that obviously genetic relations, what it means there, in the dates of African mixture in various Jewish populations. So it could be in multiple different Jewish populations. As we went over some of the finds just the other day of Jews that have that in them. And then it goes on and it lets us know, it goes on a little bit on the history. It says they reflect a history in which many of the Jewish groups descend from a common ancestral population, which is self admixed with Africans. Rather, it begin with those said Africans prior to the beginning. So they said before, prior to the beginning of the Jewish dispersa that occurred in the 8th and 6th century. Bet every Bantu is younger than that. Bet every Bantu actually diversed from the lands of the Levant. The dates that emerge from roll-off analysis in the non-Maserati Jews can also reflect events in the Greek and the Roman periods. So it's saying they still got those mixtures when there were large communities of Jews in North Africa, particularly Alexandria. Now, this is important. Why is it important? Because this is what they're saying, right? When they're looking at those Jews, right? They're looking at different Jews, Iraqi Jews, Iranian Jews, right? But if you test the Siddish, you'll probably find something interesting that they have only to Babylon, all the way to the founder that had that said African mixture. That's why they say this may reflect descent of these groups coming from a common ancestral population that already had some African ancestry prior to the Jewish dispersal. So before they even got dispersed, they would have had some African admixture. So that's what Will was showing earlier. That source is very, very, very important. So that was a very deep source, I think. So very, very deep stuff, I think, that we had to go over. We had to talk about. Very, very important. So, Brother Will, if you got anything else to show, that's all I got for now. As you see on this note, there's another part to this. I'll go over another day, as you can see right here. This just goes over the Semitic Hyksos and stuff like that. We'll go over that another time. And as you can see, we got some information to go over of the Hyksos that come in about the 12th and 13th dynasty and some things about them that might be kind of interesting, and some summaries of some mtDNAs and yDNAs of some things that I think it's going to be kind of interesting. We'll talk about another time. But other than that,
Yes, sir, brother. I don't have anything else to share in particular. Unless you need me to, but yeah, I don't have anything in particular to share.
amen. Yep, it's not interesting. It's not interesting. That cover is where. Yep, and that's why a lot of times groups they always word them. They always call them African.
And that was my main point in showing you all who that specific sub-Saharan African population was, so we can know what haplogroup it is.
Yep, and isn't that interesting how E1b1a, E1b1a V38 did not exist That's why we show you the Neolithic finds. That's the earliest fossil. It did not exist in the Paleolithic nor the Mesolithic time. But you know what did? E1b1 existed in the Mesolithic time, in the Paleolithic time. That means that for E1b1a to exist, it had to come from its father lineage, P2. So it didn't exist in the Neolithic or Mesolithic, but E1b1 did. Therefore, E1b1a had to come from E1b1 because that's just common genetic sense. You're gonna have to mutate. That mutation is gonna have to take place. Even if we take the time, here we can even solve that question right now. We can solve that question right now because some people do say that. Let me just show you right now. If I just go to M2 on Y tree, guess what it's gonna tell me about M2? That it comes from this SNP right here, P147. You know what's interesting about P147 is that we know if we go and type it down, E-P147, we can notice something interesting. Notice that it's going to lead you to a root. So right here, notice that it's going to come from M96. So it has to come from this SNP. And then notice the next SNP after it. So right here, let's go back real fast. Notice the next SNP right after that SNP, right? Because this is a mid SNP that has a mutation that has to happen. And then the next SNP right here is going to be right there, has two branches of P2. So that's very important that this group right here is actually going to have two known branches, and it's going to be P2 or this one. And this one is you barely see. So whenever you see this, they're always going to be P2. They're going to always be P2 because this one you barely ever see. But right here, P2, E1b1. And that's going to make your V38. So you can't get V38. You can't get V30 because a lot of people, when they hear E1b1a, this is E1b1a too. V38 is E1b1a, but it's going to be a root node. But it makes two sons, M2 and E1b1c right here. So M2 is going to be the one that's going to be the one they love to say is African. But it comes from the Natufian P2, E1b1. As it even says right there, it says the parental clade has an ancient presence in the Middle East. And also has some obviously distributions in Africa. But that's right off of the wiki thing because they know it themselves. Because if you connect it with its roots, E1b1 P2 makes E1b1a and E1b1b. So you can't have this family E1b1a without connecting it to its E1b1b brothers, because P2 makes E1b1a. So you gotta go from E1b1a to these ones. So if we do that, if we put this as root node, Mesolithic, Paleolithic, E1b1a didn't exist into Neolithic, Mesolithic, Paleolithic, and makes it leaving from the areas of Shem's homeland in the Levant. So P2 Natufian has connections to E1b1a as the mutation shows, right? Making V38 till you get M2.
Not only that, West Africans have PPNB ancestry.
That's right.
People
That's
just
right.
don't know.
And that's
PPNB meaning Natufian.
That's right. That's right. So I guess with that, family, if you got any more questions, yes, the deep sources that we went over today, I'll just do one more scan through summary that we just did. This is what we just touched on one more time for Bronze Age, Iron Age information. We just proved that in this area over here, early Shemites had left the Levant and settled in areas over here. And we had talked about a lot of them in Mesopotamia, and some of them that reached all the way to France, like E1b1a, but leaving from the Near East. We also talked about some of the Shemitic sons that are settled in Syria, how they have relations to Abram and everything. And then we had pointed out how they had previous lines that would be settled in, like we had said, Mesopotamia and lands around that V38. That V38 has spent time up in the same areas with E1b1b. That if E1b1b is considered Semitic, also E1b1a is, because they move together in certain areas. We also got evidence of the Shemites going into Africa before Abraham even exists. So we should have evidence of this line in Africa. You know what's interesting about that? They claim the J is Jews, but there is not a J in Africa at the time early to claim them as Joktanites. So it's very important. We also know that E1b1A can fit the Jewish lines because they are in Arabia. There's a lot of them in Arabia, and they show that they have a connection all the way to even India, being pushed out during the time of the Arab trades, having connections to the lands of the Levant. And we had touched on the ancient Jews, how we know that the ancient Jews had an African admixture as well. And a lot of them, even the ones exiled during the Babylonian exile, that's the same Jews during the Babylonian exile that was put as Spain, right? Historical connections that the Jews of the Babylonian exile also went to Spain. And they also had an African admixture. And they had settled in those areas. And we know that these lines had connections to Eurasia first. So that, with that understood, that's just a good understanding for these things, a good summary for these things. That E1b1A and some of the groups that are claimed to be African today, you got to look a little deeper into their origins. That a lot of them actually might be the scattered, dispersed Jews of ancient days. So if you got anything else, brother, that's all I got for now.
No, brother, that was just a beautiful breakdown. You broke everything down good. You went through the timelines, the different phases, the different events,
Amen, amen. And with that,
history that
family,
led up to the Semites and the Israelites.
that's right. That's right, family. So with that, family, this one might be one that you might need to go back and review and watch. I'm definitely going to. I gotta eat my own. As they say, the farmer eats his own fruit and whatnot of his own labor. So Will brought some. If you didn't see, Will brought some stuff out earlier today. That's really nice. I'll put that in the description, and I'll put the sources in the description afterwards. With that, family, be blessed, be beloved, and amen.